The chandeliers in the Grand Meridian Ballroom cost more than most people earned in a year. Evelyn Carter had learned that fact the night Grant first brought her here, 3 years ago, his hand warm at the small of her back, his voice low and proud as he pointed out the crystal drops, each one imported from Austria, each one polished by hand before every event. He had looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing in the room. She had believed him. For 7 years, she had believed nearly everything Grant Calloway told her. She would not make that mistake again after tonight. The moment that split her life in two did not announce itself. There was no warning, no tremor in the air, no instinct firing loud enough to make her step back from the edge. 1 second she was standing at the edge of the ballroom floor, in the silver dress she had bought 3 months ago, the dress she had kept wrapped in tissue paper because Grant said he wanted her to wear it somewhere special. The next second, the microphone was in Grant's hand. His smile was aimed at the room, and the woman beside him was not Evelyn. Her name was Claudine Voss. Evelyn recognized her immediately. Manhattan was large, but its upper circles were suffocatingly small, and Claudine moved through those circles like she had been born swimming in them, which she had. Old money on her mother's side, newer, sharper money on her father's. She was laughing at something Grant had whispered before he raised the microphone, her hand already resting on his forearm with the practiced ease of a woman who had been rehearsing that gesture for longer than tonight. Grant did not look for Evelyn in the crowd. That was the detail that cut the deepest. Not what he said next. Not the applause that rippled across the room when he lifted Claudine's hand and turned so the light caught the ring she was already wearing. Not even the moment when New York's wealthiest families began murmuring to each other, heads tilting, eyes sliding toward the corners of the room where Evelyn stood, holding a champagne glass she suddenly could not remember picking up. The detail that would stay with her for years was this: Grant never looked for her first. Most people, when they do something that will destroy another person, at least look. At least locate the damage before they cause it. Grant simply did not. I've spent the last few years understanding what it means to build something that lasts, he was saying, his voice carrying easily across the room because the Calloway family had always known how to fill a space. And I've realized that the person standing beside you matters more than almost anything else. You need someone who understands ambition, someone who doesn't just support your vision, but shares it. Claudine and I have been discussing a future together for some time now, and tonight I wanted the people who matter most to this family to be the first to celebrate with us. The champagne glass was very cold in Evelyn's hand. She set it down on the nearest table. She did this carefully because her hands had developed a fine tremor she did not want anyone to notice. The table belonged to a couple she vaguely knew, the husband, a hedge fund manager, the wife, a woman who had always been slightly too interested in other people's misfortunes. And Evelyn felt, rather than saw, the woman's attention swing toward her like a spotlight she hadn't consented to stand in. She did not look back at the stage. She did not search Grant's face for remorse or apology or even the decency of acknowledgement. She had spent 7 years reading Grant Calloway's expressions, and she did not need to see this particular one. She already knew what it looked like when he had decided something was no longer useful to him. She had watched him make that face at business partners, at vendors who missed deadlines, at a housekeeper who had worked for its fans family for 11 years before he determined she was too slow. She had argued with him about that housekeeper. He had listened patiently and then done exactly what he intended to do. The crowd was applauding more firmly now. Someone near the bar let out a sharp celebratory whistle. The sound felt physical, like a hand against the side of her face. Evelyn reached for the small clasp on her engagement ring. Her fingers knew the motion from years of habit, from the dozens of nights she had slipped it off before washing dishes or kneading dough for the bread she baked every Sunday. The bread Grant claimed he loved until the Sunday he informed her that Claudine's family chef made a superior sourdough. The clasp gave on the first try. She held the ring in her palm for a moment, feeling its weight, which was considerable. 3.5 carats. She had never asked for anything that large. Grant had insisted. He told her it was about making a statement. She set the ring on the table beside the champagne glass. The hedge fund wife's breath caught audibly. Evelyn walked toward the exit. She did not run. She kept her chin level and her pace measured, and she looked at no one, because looking at people required acknowledging their expressions, and she did not have the capacity for that right now. She could feel the room tracking her. She was aware of conversation stalling, of heads turning, of the particular social electricity that moves through a crowd when something genuinely unexpected has happened. Grant Calloway's fiancée of 7 years had just removed her engagement ring in public and walked out of his family's gala, and in this particular room, that was the kind of event people discussed at their next 3 dinner parties. The lobby air was cooler. Her heels were loud on marble. She did not stop at the coat check because her coat was somewhere inside and she was not going back. She pushed through the heavy front doors, and the November air hit her immediately, cold and sharp, and carrying the particular New York smell of exhaust and wet concrete, and something unidentifiable that she had always privately loved about this city. She stood on the hotel steps and breathed. Her phone was in her clutch. She could call her sister. She could call her friend Dana, who would answer on the first ring, and would say exactly the right things, and would arrive within 45 minutes with terrible wine and good instincts. She could call a car service. She could do any of several reasonable things that a reasonable woman did when her life collapsed on a Tuesday evening in November. She was still deciding when she noticed the vehicles. There were 4 of them, black and sleek and expensive, arranged along the hotel's drive with the particular precision that suggested they had not arrived by accident. 3 were modern SUVs, the kind with tinted windows that told you nothing about what was inside. The 4th was different, older. A Rolls-Royce in a color so dark it absorbed the streetlights rather than reflecting them, its chrome details polished to a mirror finish that made the surrounding night look slightly unreal. A driver in a dark coat stood beside its rear door, and when Evelyn stepped off the final stairfer, this driver's attention shifted to her with an alertness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. He was already moving toward her, Miss Carter. Not a question. He had known what she looked like before she appeared. Mr. Roman Calloway has been expecting you. She had heard the name. Everyone in New York had heard the name, though most people heard it only at a distance, in the careful phrasing of financial journalists, who understood exactly how much they could print without consequences, in the lowered voices of people who did business adjacent to the Calloway empire and preferred to keep their proximity vague. Roman Calloway was Grant's father. He was also, depending on who you asked and how much they trusted you, the man behind the legitimate face of a family organization that had been rewriting its own history for 40 years. She had met him twice, both times briefly. Both times he had looked at her as though he was confirming something he already suspected. "I don't have an appointment with Roman Calloway," she said. "No," the driver agreed pleasantly. "He made the appointment for you. He anticipated you would be available this evening." Evelyn looked at the Rolls-Royce. She looked at the hotel doors behind her, through which she could still faintly hear the sound of applause and music, and a ballroom full of people celebrating the future of a man who had just erased her from his. She looked at the driver, who was waiting with the patient unhurried stillness of someone who had been told she would get in the car. "He anticipated," she repeated. "Mr. Calloway is rarely wrong about these things." It was the most absurd thing she had done in 7 years of generally sensible decisions. She got in the car. The door closed behind her with the soft, definitive sound of something expensive and well-engineered, and then she was inside, and the night city moved past the windows, and across the back seat from her, separated by perhaps 4 feet of dark leather, and a kind of stillness she could feel against her skin, sat Roman Calloway. He was 63 years old. She knew this because she had once, early in her relationship with Grant, looked him up out of the ordinary curiosity of a woman meeting her future father-in-law. The photographs available online were sparse and carefully managed, most of them years old, most of them taken at charity events, where he appeared at the edge of frames rather than their center. In person he was larger than photographs suggested, not in height exactly, but in presence, the kind of man who made the space around him feel smaller simply by occupying it. His hair was silver. His suit was charcoal and fit with the unself-conscious precision of a man who had worn good clothes long enough to stop noticing them. His hands resting on his knee were very still. His eyes were on her. "You walked out before he finished his speech," Roman said. His voice was quieter than she expected. Most men with his kind of power had learned to project. He had apparently learned something different. "That was faster than I anticipated." "You were watching." "I was watching," he confirmed, without apology. She felt anger then, a clean, clarifying anger that cut through the shock of the last 20 minutes like a blade. "You knew he was going to do that tonight." Roman considered this. It was a brief consideration. The kind that suggested the question was not whether to answer, but how much of the answer to give. "I knew he had been planning something of this nature for several months," he said. "I did not know he would choose to do it publicly. That particular decision was his own. You could have warned me." "Yes." The word landed without softness, without excuse, without the cushioning that most people applied to uncomfortable truths. Just yes. She stared at him. Why didn't you? Roman looked out the window for a moment. Manhattan moved past, the grid of light and shadow that never entirely stopped, the city's indifference to individual disasters, a quality she had always found oddly comforting. Because a warning would have changed what you did, he said. And I needed to see what you would do when you had no warning at all. That is a genuinely terrible thing to say to me right now. I know, he looked back at her. Did you cry? Question was so direct it bypassed her defenses entirely. No, did you want to? She thought about the champagne glass, cold in her hand. The ring, the weight of it, the years it represented. That's not your business. Roman almost smiled. It did not reach his eyes, but it was not unkind. Did you look back at him? No. Did you even consider it? She opened her mouth to answer, and then stopped, because the honest answer surprised her. She had not considered it, not for a single second. The moment the ring left her finger, the direction was fixed, and she had simply moved in the direction that was not him, and it had not felt like a choice so much as a fact she was finally acknowledging. No, she said, I didn't. Roman nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he had written down before she arrived. 7 years, he said. That is a long time to walk away from without looking back. He didn't look for me before he spoke, she said. He was going to cause the worst moment of my life, and he didn't even look to see where I was standing. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before it. Roman was watching her with an attention that was nothing like Grant's attention, which had always been slightly performative, calibrated to an audience of one. Roman's attention was the attention of someone who was trying to understand something, fully and without distortion. It was uncomfortable and oddly respectful at the same time. He wouldn't have. The car slowed. She had not been tracking their route. They were no longer in Midtown. The streets outside were quieter, the buildings lower, and they were moving toward a gate that was opening as they approached, as though the car itself was expected, which it presumably was. Beyond the gate she could see a driveway lined with old trees whose bare branches reached into the orange-gray sky, and beyond the trees, light in the windows of a house that was significantly larger than anything she had known Grant's family owned within the city. Where are we? She asked. Home, Roman said simply. Car passed through the gate. The iron closed behind them. Evelyn Carter, who had walked into the night with nothing but a silver dress and 7 years of discarded belief, looked at the house ahead of her and understood, in some part of herself that was still functioning clearly beneath the shock, that whatever came next was going to be nothing at all like what she had planned for her life. She was not certain whether that was a threat or an offer. She suspected Roman Calloway knew which it was. She suspected he had known for quite some time. What she could not yet determine was why a man who ran half of New York from the shadows had been sitting in a car outside a hotel, waiting specifically for her, on the night his son decided she was no longer worth keeping. That question, she realized, as the car came to a stop, was the only one that mattered now. And she intended to have an answer before the night was over. But before that, if this story reached something inside you, if you've ever given everything to someone who simply decided you weren't enough anymore, I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment with the city and country where you're watching from. These stories travel farther than I ever imagined, and I want to see exactly how far this one goes. The house was not what she expected, which was the first thing Roman Calloway had surprised her with, and she suspected it would not be the last. She had expected something that announced itself. The Calloway name carried a particular weight in New York, the kind of weight that usually expressed itself in marble foyers and oil paintings selected by decorators who charged more per hour than most attorneys. Grant's apartment on the Upper East Side had been exactly that beautiful, in the way that expensive things were beautiful when someone had been paid to make them so. Every surface calibrated to impress, nothing chosen for comfort or meaning, or the simple fact that someone loved it. The estate was different. The entrance hall had wooden floors that were old enough to have developed their own character. The kind of worn smooth grain that came from decades of actual living rather than deliberate distressing. There were books on the shelves that looked red. A coat hung near the door that had seen weather. The whole place had the particular quality of a house that had been lived in by one person for a very long time, and that person had stopped caring what visitors thought of it somewhere around the 20th year. A woman in her 50s appeared from a side corridor and took Roman's coat without being asked. He said her name Margaret and asked about the kitchen, and she answered in the unhurried shorthand of long familiarity. Evelyn stood slightly apart from this exchange, still in the silver dress, still without her coat, and felt the adrenaline that had carried her from the ballroom to the car beginning to metabolize into something colder and less useful. She was in Roman Calloway's house. She had gotten into his car without asking nearly enough questions. Her engagement ring was sitting on a table in a hotel ballroom, and Grant was probably still on the microphone. "You're cold," Roman said. He was looking at her arms, which had developed the fine, continuous tremor of someone whose body had decided to process shock through the muscles. "Come." She followed him because the alternative was standing in an unfamiliar hallway being cold, which was not meaningfully better. He led her to a room off the main corridor, a study by the look of it, with a fireplace that was already lit and two chairs positioned at the angle of people who expected to talk rather than simply occupy the same space. On the low table between them sat a tray she had not heard anyone prepare: tea, a small plate of plain crackers, a folded blanket that she suspected Margaret had placed there in the 3 minutes since their arrival. She sat. She pulled the blanket across her lap because her legs had begun shaking, and she preferred to cover that information. She did not reach for the tea immediately because her hands were not steady enough yet, and she had already shown Roman Calloway more vulnerability in 40 minutes than she had shown most people in years. Roman sat across from her and waited. This was the second thing that surprised her about him. Most powerful men she had encountered were uncomfortable with silence. They filled it compulsively with opinions or questions, or the low-grade performance of authority. Roman seemed to experience silence as simply a different kind of conversation, one he was equally comfortable in. He sat with his hands folded and his eyes on her, and he did not say a word while she pulled herself together, which took approximately 4 minutes and required most of her remaining composure. "You said you were expecting me," she finally said. "I did. That implies you knew what Grant was going to do, and you made arrangements based on that knowledge." "Yes." Why? Roman reached forward and poured tea into the cup nearest her. He did not hand it to her. He simply placed it within reach and leaned back. "Because someone needed to. That is not an answer. The beginning of one." He studied her. "Do you know how long I've known your name, Miss Carter?" She thought about it. She and Grant had dated for 7 years. She had met Roman twice, both times briefly. Both times at events where he appeared and disappeared with the efficiency of a man who found social gatherings useful only in controlled doses. 7 years, she said. When Grant and I started, 4 years before that, the blanket was warm against her legs. The fire was doing its work. She processed what he had said and found she could not make it fit any logical frame she currently had available. "That's not possible." "You worked for the Hargrove Foundation when you were 26, Roman said. "You organized their annual fundraiser for 3 consecutive years. The 3rd year, you identified an accounting irregularity in their grant-making process that had gone unnoticed for 6 years. You didn't report it externally. You brought it to the executive director privately and helped them correct it without scandal because you understood that a public exposure would have destroyed the foundation's ability to continue its work. The families who depended on that foundation never knew how close it came to collapse." Evelyn's hands went still in her lap. "How do you know about that?" "I donated to the Hargrove Foundation for 11 years, Roman said. When the irregularity was quietly corrected, I asked why. The executive director, to her credit, protected your name. But I have resources she did not anticipate." He paused. "I began paying attention to you at that point." The fire made a sound. Somewhere in the house, something settled, the particular sound of old architecture adjusting to temperature. Evelyn looked at Roman Calloway across the firelit table and tried to understand the shape of what he was telling her. "You've been watching me," she said. "For 11 years. Periodically, with intention. That should frighten me." "And does it?" She considered this honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "No," she said, "it surprises me. That's different." Something moved in Roman's expression. It was not warmth exactly, but it was recognition, the specific expression of a person who has found, in an unexpected place, evidence that their judgment was correct. "Grant told me you were direct," he said. He meant it as a complaint. "I know. He found it exhausting. I know that too." Roman stood. He moved to a cabinet along the far wall, opened it, and removed a folder. Not a thin folder. A folder with the compressed, solid weight of a document that had been accumulating for years. He returned to his chair and placed it on the table between them, without opening it. "Before I show you what's in there," he said, "I want you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you is not a recruitment. It's not a manipulation. You can leave this house at any point tonight, and I will have you taken wherever you want to go, and none of what happens in this room will follow you unless you decide you want it to." She looked at the folder, then at him. "You're doing a very effective impression of a man being transparent. I'm aware of how it looks. Do you understand why I might not simply believe you? Yes. I also understand that you are still sitting here, which suggests that whatever I am more interesting to you right now than the alternative. She reached for the tea and her hands were steady enough now. She drank. It was plain black tea, strong, no sugar, exactly what she would have chosen if asked. She set the cup down. Show me. He opened the folder. The photographs were not what she expected. She had braced herself for something sordid, the visual evidence of surveillance she would find violating and cold. Instead, she was looking at images of herself that had the peculiar intimacy of moments she barely remembered. Herself at a pharmacy, paying for a prescription she recognized as her neighbor Mrs. Dalton's arthritis medication, the one Evelyn had started collecting because Mrs. Dalton's hip made the 3 flights of stairs increasingly unreliable. Herself at a shelter drop-off, carrying bags she had packed from her own closet. Herself in the parking lot of the hospital where her mother had been treated, sitting in her car with her head against the steering wheel for a long time before going inside to be composed and capable for someone who needed her to be. She looked through all of them. She did not speak. 4 years ago, Roman said, a man contacted you through Grant's office. He represented himself as a consulting vendor. He offered you $100,000 in exchange for proprietary client information from a Calloway subsidiary. Information that was legally accessible through Grant's files and would have been untraceable if removed carefully. Evelyn looked up. I remember him. What did you do? I told him I wasn't interested, and I had him removed from the building. You didn't tell Grant. Grant would have used it to start a war with whatever competitor sent the man. I had no proof of who sent him. I had no proof of anything, except that someone had tried to bribe me. Starting a conflict over that felt like exactly the kind of escalation that makes things worse. She paused. So I kept a record of the meeting, stored it somewhere Grant didn't have access to, and I watched to see if anything similar happened again. Roman was very still. Of course I kept a record. I'm not naive. Where is it? Somewhere you don't have access to either. She held his gaze. Is that a problem? The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Roman Calloway looked at Evelyn Carter across a firelit table in a house that smelled like old wood and decades of real living, and something shifted in his bearing that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It was not intimidation. It was not displeasure. It was the particular recalibration of a man who had expected to be several steps ahead and had discovered that the distance was shorter than he assumed. The man who approached you, Roman said carefully, was sent by someone inside the Calloway organization. The fire was warm. She did not move, I suspected. You suspected and said nothing. I suspected and waited, she said. Those are different things. Roman closed the folder. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her, with an expression she had no existing category for. My son, he said slowly, spent 7 years with the most strategically careful person he had ever encountered and managed to learn nothing from it. Grant learns from people he respects, Evelyn said. He's not capable of respecting someone he thinks needs him. Did he think you needed him? By the end? Yes. He'd revised history enough times that he genuinely believed my competence belonged to him. That I functioned because of his support rather than despite his interference. She heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not bother to sand it down. She was past the point of performing equanimity for Roman Calloway. If he had 11 years of photographs of her paying for a neighbor's medication, he had earned her honesty. He introduced me at events as his partner. What he meant was his support system. Roman was quiet for a moment. Then what did you do before Grant? Exactly what I was doing during Grant, only with better sleep. Roman's mouth curved. It was brief and she almost missed it. I want to show you something else, he said. Not tonight. Tomorrow. Will you stay? She looked at him. The question was strange, not because it was inappropriate, but because of how it was asked. There was no pressure in it, no assumption. It sat in the air between them exactly as stated, a question with actual room for the answer to be no. I don't have clothes, she said. Margaret can arrange something. I don't know you. No, but you got in my car. That was a lapse in judgment. Perhaps. Or perhaps you're already better at reading people than you've been given credit for. He stood. The room at the top of the stairs. Margaret will show you. If you decide to leave before morning, the driver will take you wherever you choose. No questions. He picked up the folder and moved toward the door. He was nearly through it when she spoke. The man who tried to bribe me, she said. Does Grant know who sent him? Roman stopped. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his expression had closed into something careful and measured. No, do you? A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. Yes, and the person who sent him, Evelyn said. Are they still inside your organization? Roman looked at her across the room. The fire threw his shadow long against the wall behind him. Get some rest, Miss Carter, he said. Tomorrow is going to require you at your clearest. He left. The door did not close all the way behind him, which she suspected was intentional. The The particular thoughtfulness of a man who understood that a woman alone in an unfamiliar house needed the reminder that she could leave through it. She sat by the fire for a long time. She drank the rest of the tea. She thought about the folder and the photographs, and the man who had come to Grant's office 4 years ago with a number that should have been tempting and wasn't. She thought about the record she had kept, stored in an encrypted folder on a personal cloud account Grant had never known existed, because Evelyn had learned early that there were parts of yourself you kept protected, not out of deception, but out of simple self-preservation. She thought about Roman's face when she told him she had kept a record, that precise arrested stillness, as though she had done something that validated a very long bet. She was still thinking about it when Margaret appeared in the doorway to show her upstairs. The room was simple, clean. The bed had extra blankets. On the small dresser, someone had placed a glass of water and a bottle of aspirin, which was either thoughtfulness or very good intelligence about how this particular night was affecting her. Possibly both. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed of nothing she could remember, which was its own kind of mercy. Morning came gray and cold through the windows. She woke with the particular clarity that sometimes followed genuinely catastrophic nights, the strange calm of a person who has already absorbed the worst and found themselves still standing on the other side of it. She lay still for a few minutes and took stock of herself the way she had learned to do in the years she spent managing situations that required her to be functional regardless of what she felt, body, breath, mind, all present, all operational. The grief was there, it would be there. For a long time she knew, the specific grief of 7 years of genuine love for a man who turned out to be a significantly smaller person than she had believed. But grief was familiar territory, and she knew how to move through it without letting it set the pace. She dressed in the clothes Margaret had left: dark trousers, a soft gray sweater, both fitting with a precision that suggested Roman Calloway's idea of arrangement, extended to knowing a woman's size from a photograph, and went downstairs. Roman was already at the table. There was coffee, eggs, toast, a newspaper folded to the business section. He stood when she entered, which was such an unexpected formality that it briefly stopped her in the doorway. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some you?" "I don't sleep much." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, eat something." She sat. She ate. They did not speak for a few minutes, which should have been awkward and wasn't, which was the third thing that surprised her about him. He poured her coffee without asking how she took it and got it exactly right, black, no sugar, and she wondered how many people in her life had ever bothered to simply observe that information instead of asking. Grant had asked every single time for 7 years. He had asked and forgotten within 48 hours, and then asked again, as though the answer was not worth retaining, as though the details of how she took her coffee were not worth the storage space. "I want to take you through the business accounts this morning," Roman said. "There are several things I'd like a second set of eyes on." She set down the coffee. "Why mine specifically?" "Because your eyes don't belong to this family." "Neither do I." "That's precisely why." He met her gaze steadily. "Everyone inside the Calloway organization has a stake in what they see. They read the accounts through the lens of what they need the accounts to say. You have no stake. You have no history here. You would read them as what they actually are." She thought about this. "You have accountants. I have 4 accountants who have been with this family between 12 and 22 years. I trust them absolutely on matters of execution. On matters of interpretation, long familiarity creates blind spots. And you think I won't have blind spots. I think your blind spots are in completely different places than theirs." He picked up his coffee. "I think that's valuable." She looked at him across the breakfast table in the gray morning light and tried again to locate the manipulation in what he was offering. She was not naive enough to believe Roman Calloway operated without agenda. Every word he spoke had been chosen. Every piece of information he had released had been calculated for effect. But calculation was not the same thing as deception. A man could be entirely strategic and still be telling the truth. She had known that for years. She had simply spent 7 of them with someone who used strategy in place of truth rather than alongside it. "What am I looking for?" she asked. "I don't want to tell you," Roman said. "I want to see what you find." The offices were in a separate wing of the estate that she had not seen the night before. They were spare and functional, nothing like the curated, expensive surfaces of Grant's workspace, and the financial records Roman placed in front of her were organized with a meticulous clarity that suggested someone who understood that obfuscation was its own kind of admission. She worked for 3 hours. Roman left her alone. Margaret brought more coffee at the 90-minute mark, said nothing, and left without waiting for acknowledgement. Evelyn spread the documents across the table in the order that made sense to her, rather than the order in which they had been arranged, a habit from her Hargrove Foundation years, and began moving through them with the particular focus that came when a problem was complex enough to crowd out everything else. The first thing she noticed was a rhythm, not in the obvious places, not in the flagged accounts or the ones with marginal notation, but in the timing. Consulting contract payments going out in the third week of each month, regular as breathing, to 4 different companies across 18 months. The amounts varied, the timing did not. And the companies, when she pulled their registration details from the supplementary documents Roman had included, without explanation, shared a single characteristic that none of the account annotations mentioned. They had all been registered within a 6-month window, and all 4 registrations listed the same law firm as their agent of record. She went back through the approvals. Grant's initials appeared on everyone. She sat back, her neck ached. She had been leaning forward without noticing for the better part of 2 hours. Grant's initials appeared on every single consulting contract that fed into those 4 companies. Not his signature, his initials, which was the approval method used for routine vendor payments below a certain threshold, the kind of thing that crossed a senior executive's desk at a volume that made careful reading impractical. Someone had structured these payments specifically to stay beneath that threshold. Someone had understood exactly how Grant processed his approvals quickly, confidently, without the painstaking scrutiny he should have applied but found tedious, and had built the entire scheme around that knowledge. Grant had not designed this. Someone had designed it using Grant. She was still sitting with that understanding when the door opened and Grant walked in. She heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his footsteps that she would have recognized anywhere after 7 years, the slightly forward-weighted stride of a man who moved through spaces as though they were already arranged for his benefit. She did not look up immediately. She finished the thought she was in the middle of, marked the document in front of her with a paper clip from the tray at her right hand, and then looked up. He stopped when he saw her. Something crossed his face too fast to catalog surprise, she thought, and beneath that something she might once have called guilt. Though on Grant it was difficult to distinguish guilt from the discomfort of being caught in an inconvenient position. Evelyn. He said her name the way he always had, like it was a point being made rather than a person being addressed. "What are you doing here working?" she said. "In my father's office." "In your father's estate. He invited me." Grant looked at the document spread across the table. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the microbe she had spent years learning to read. The one that appeared when something was not proceeding according to his internal script. "He invited you," he repeated. "When last night?" "Last night he moved into the room. He did not sit." He stood on the other side of the table, with his hands in his pockets, and his shoulders in the particular configuration of a man who was working hard to appear more relaxed than he was. He had a car waiting. Yes, he planned this. He planned the car. What happened last night was your plan. The directness landed. She watched it land. Grant's shoulders shifted, and he looked away briefly, toward the window, and in that brief turn she saw something she recognized from their 7 years. The specific expression of a man who has done something he cannot quite defend, but has not yet located the apology for it. Grant was not without conscience. He was simply a person whose conscience operated on a significant delay, filtered through multiple layers of rationalization before it reached the surface. "I should have talked to you first," he said finally. "Before the announcement in front of 300 people. Yes." He looked back at her. It wasn't how I intended it to happen." "How did you intend it to happen?" "I was going to tell you before the gala. I arrived late, and then it seemed like he stopped." His jaw worked. "I handled it badly." Evelyn looked at him across the document she had spent the morning uncovering. This man she had loved. This man she had organized her life around. This man who had flown them to Paris for their 3rd anniversary and cried, genuinely cried, at a tiny museum in the Marais because he saw a painting that reminded him of her, and who had also, apparently, been allowing someone to use his authority to drain his family's organization while he was too busy performing confidence to read his own documents carefully. "Grant," she said, "sit down." Something in her tone reached him. He sat. "I need you to look at something," she said. She turned 3 documents to face him and pointed to the contract dates, the approval initials, the company registrations. She walked him through what she had found without editorializing, without accusation, simply as information arranged in sequence. She watched his face as she talked. She watched understanding arrive, slowly at first and then fast too fast. The way it moved across his features when the shape of a thing became undeniable. When she finished, he was very still. "I didn't know," he said. "I believe you. Someone he stopped. Someone who knew how I processed approvals. Someone who had access to your workflow. Someone close enough to your daily operations to understand your habits precisely. She held his gaze. Someone who has been inside this family for a long time. Grant's color had changed. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely frightened. Not the performed urgency he deployed in negotiations. Actual fear, the kind that arrived when a person understood that the ground beneath a long-built structure was less solid than they had assumed. How much? He asked. I can't give you a final number without going further back. What I've found in the last 3 hours, conservatively, several millions. The pattern goes back at least 18 months, possibly further. Evelyn, his voice had changed. The performance had gone out of it entirely. He sounded like someone she had once known better than this. Why are you? He stopped. Started again. You don't owe this family anything. You don't owe me anything. Why are you sitting here doing this? It was the best question he had asked her in years. She had been asking herself a version of it since she sat down with the documents. I'm not doing it for you, she said, or for this family. Then why? She looked at the documents. She thought about the Hargrove Foundation and the irregularity she had found and quietly corrected because the work the foundation did was worth protecting even if the people running it had made mistakes. She thought about the way Roman had looked at her across the breakfast table. She thought about the photographs in the folder herself in a pharmacy parking lot, herself at a shelter drop-off, and the strange, dislocating feeling of being seen for the specific things she had always done quietly, in the absence of an audience. Because it's the right thing to do, she said, and because I'm good at it. Grant stared at her. He opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked down at the documents. When he looked up again, his expression had cycled through something she didn't have time to trace before the door opened a second time. Roman stood in the doorway. He looked at his son, then at the documents, then at Evelyn. His face was unreadable, but his eyes moved across the scene with the rapid, integrating attention of a man who had arrived, expecting to find one thing, and found instead that the conversation had moved significantly further than he anticipated. Grant, he said. His voice was very quiet. How long have you been here? 20 minutes. Grant stood. The dynamic in the room had changed, was still changing, the air pressure of it shifting the way it shifted before weather. Dad, she found something. In the accounts. I know. Grant looked at him. You know, I've known for several weeks that something was wrong. I didn't know the shape of it. Roman moved into the room and stood at the end of the table, looking at the documents Evelyn had arranged. He studied them for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. Tell me, she told him, more fully this time, with the additional layer she had been developing while Grant was in the room. The law firm, the registration dates, the threshold structuring, the approval pattern. She laid it out with the same flat clarity she had used with Grant. No inflection, no urgency, just the facts in the sequence that made their meaning inescapable. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. The law firm, Roman said, Pendleton and Associates. Registered agent for all 4 companies. Roman's expression didn't change. But something happened in his eyes, a particular compression, a narrowing of something that had been, until this moment, held deliberately open. Pendleton, he said. You know them, Evelyn said. Darius Pendleton has been the Calloway family's legal counsel for 19 years. The fire cracked in a different part of the house. Grant made a sound she had never heard from him before, something low and involuntary, the sound of a foundation giving way. No, he said, not as a denial, as a refusal of the information, the way a body refused something it couldn't metabolize. Grant. Roman's voice was steady but had developed an edge that Evelyn felt against her skin. Go to the main study. Wait for me there, Dad. Now. Grant went. His footsteps in the hall were slower than they had been coming in. Roman stood at the end of the table and looked at Evelyn. The morning light had shifted while she worked, and now came through the windows at an angle that caught the silver of his hair and the deep lines of his face, and she thought, with the strange, sideways clarity of exhaustion and adrenaline, that he looked like a man who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and had just received confirmation that the thing was heavier than he had estimated. You found all of this in 3 hours, he said. I found the pattern in 3 hours. The full picture will take longer. How much longer? Days, maybe a week, depending on how far back the earliest contracts go and whether the structure changed at any point. He nodded slowly. He looked at the documents and then at her. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need an honest answer. I've been giving you those. I know. That's why I'm asking. He pulled out the chair Grant had vacated and sat down, which surprised her. She had not expected him to sit, had expected him to remain standing with the particular authority of his height and stillness. Sitting made him look tired. Perhaps he was. When Grant walked in, Roman said, Did you tell him what you found? Yes. Everything. What I had confirmed. Not the Pendleton connection. I made that inference while he was sitting here. How did he react? He was frightened, she said. Genuinely, not performing, she paused. He didn't know Roman. What I found, he was used. Someone with very precise knowledge of his habits designed this specifically around his weaknesses. Roman's eyes were on her fists. You're defending him. I'm describing what I observed. She met his gaze without flinching. I'm not defending him. What happened last night happened. He handled it the way he handles most things with confidence, where he should have had careful thought, and with someone else's feelings placed well below his own preferences. I'm not forgiving that. I'm telling you that the financial situation is different from the personal one, and I think you already know that. Roman was quiet. The silence had that quality again, not empty but full, containing something she couldn't quite read. He chose Claudine Voss, Roman said finally, because she told him she admired his vision. That's all it took. 7 years with someone who genuinely loved him and understood his flaws, and all it took to replace that was a woman who told him his vision was admirable. Evelyn said nothing. He has never been able to tolerate being seen clearly, Roman said. It's the thing I failed to correct in him. I saw it when he was young, and I thought he would grow out of it, and instead he grew into it. He looked at the table. His mother was the same. She needed to be seen as exceptional. The moment any relationship required her to be ordinary, she left. You're telling me this for a reason, Evelyn said. I'm telling you this because you deserve to understand the full history of what you walked away from. He looked up. And because I want you to understand that when I say Grant made the wrong choice, I am not speaking as a father who disapproves of his son's decisions. I am speaking as a man who has watched this family fail for decades at the simplest possible thing, which is choosing people over performance. Roman's voice was even. Choosing someone who is actually present over someone who simply appears to be. He held her gaze. You were present for 7 years. You noticed things nobody paid you to notice. You protected things you had no obligation to protect. You kept records of a bribery attempt and said nothing, because causing a war felt irresponsible. You found a decade-long fraud in 3 hours, and your first instinct was to make sure the innocent party was distinguished from the guilty one. Evelyn's throat had tightened. She did not speak. I have run this organization for 31 years, Roman said, and I am telling you, with complete clarity, that I have never not once had someone in this room who operated the way you operate. The morning had gone fully bright outside. The documents were spread between them on the table, the quiet evidence of a betrayal that went back years, that had been built inside this family by someone who understood its architecture perfectly. Somewhere in the house, Grant was waiting in the main study, and somewhere in a Manhattan law office, a man named Darius Pendleton was beginning another Tuesday, without knowing that the 3 hours Evelyn Carter had just spent with a stack of financial records had ended whatever future he had assumed was secure. I need to know, Evelyn said carefully, what you're asking me to do. Roman reached into his jacket and removed a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. He placed it on the table between them. She looked at it without touching it. Open it, he said. She unfolded it. It was a document she recognized by format, a formal letter of engagement, the kind used when a family retained an advisor. The role described was one she had no existing title, for it sat somewhere between financial consultant and strategic partner, with language that was precise and unusual, and had clearly been drafted by someone who understood exactly what they were creating. The name on the line was already filled in. Hers, the date at the top was yesterday's. He had prepared this before the gala, before Grant made his announcement. Before she had walked out of the ballroom or gotten into his car or spent a night in his guest room or found a 19-year fraud inside 3 hours of document review. He had prepared this the day before any of it happened. She looked up at him. You were going to offer me this, regardless of what I found today, she said, because of the records, the 11 years of observation, because of who you are. He was watching her with the same focused, unperforming attention he had given her the previous night. What you found today confirmed it. It didn't create it. She held the document. She thought about her apartment, which Grant's name was not on, but which Grant's presence had shaped for years. She thought about her career, which she had kept deliberately adjacent to his, deliberately smaller, because she had told herself she was being supportive and had never examined carefully enough how much of that was love and how much was accommodation of a man who was most comfortable when she was slightly behind him. She thought about the Hargrove Foundation and the irregularity and the quiet satisfaction of fixing something that mattered. She thought about Roman's face, across the table, patient and watchful and more honest with her in 18 hours than Grant had managed in 7 years. If I sign this, she said, I am inside this family. That comes with consequences I don't fully understand yet. Yes, and I will not pretend otherwise. The person who designed this fraud, she tapped the documents, is someone who has been here for 19 years and knows this organization better than almost anyone. When he finds out what I found, I become a problem for him. You do, Roman said. That is not a small thing. No, she agreed. It isn't. She looked at the document. She looked at the date. She thought about the night before, and the ballroom, and the ring sitting on a hotel table, and the driver who had known her name before she spoke. She thought about the way Roman had sat in silence while she put herself back together, and the coffee made exactly as she took it, and the blanket that had been waiting by the fire. She thought about Grant's face when he said someone used my approval pattern. The first genuine reckoning she had ever seen him have with himself. She picked up the pen from the tray at her right hand. And then the door opened for the third time, and the Calloway family attorney, a man she had never met, stood in the frame with a face the color of old paper and said, in a voice stripped of all professional composure, Roman, there's something you need to see immediately. The attorney's name was Bernard Hale, and in 23 years of practicing law for the Calloway family, Evelyn had never seen a man so thoroughly evacuated of professional composure. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, the kind of attorney whose suits cost more than most people's monthly rent, and who had the practiced stillness of someone paid to remain calm in rooms where other people were falling apart. That stillness was gone. His collar was open at the button. His briefcase was held against his body with both hands, the knuckles showing white, and the color had drained from his face with the specific completeness of a person who has absorbed information that their body has not yet figured out how to process. Roman stood. He did this with a speed that was quiet and absolute, and told Evelyn more about the nature of his authority than anything she had witnessed in the previous 18 hours. Close the door, he said. Hale closed it. He looked at Evelyn. Then at Roman. She stays, Roman said before Hale could form the question. Hale's jaw shifted. Whatever he was carrying was clearly not intended for an audience that included a woman he had never met. But he looked at Roman's face and made the calculation that most people made when Roman Calloway spoke in that particular register, and he set his briefcase on the table and opened it. The documents he removed were not financial records. They were surveillance photographs different from the ones in Roman's folder, darker in tone and composition, taken at angles that suggested distance rather than deliberate observation. People entering and exiting a building she did not recognize. Parking garage. Two men in conversation beneath a concrete overhang, their faces turned slightly away from whoever had taken the photograph, but not turned enough. Roman looked at the photographs for exactly 4 seconds. Then he looked at Hale when. The photographs were taken 6 weeks ago, Hale said. His voice had the strained, effortful quality of someone reading a prepared statement while simultaneously trying not to vomit. I received them this morning, hand-delivered to my home address. He paused. Not my office address, my home. Who sent them? There was no identification. The envelope contained the photographs and a single typed line. Hale reached into the briefcase and removed a small evidence bag, the kind of plastic bag that a cautious man used when he understood that a document might matter later in a legal context, and placed it on the table. Through the plastic, Evelyn could read the typed text clearly. You are not the only one who has been watching. Roman picked up the evidence bag. He held it for a moment. Then he set it down and looked at the photographs again. And Evelyn watched something move across his face that she had not seen there before. Not fear, not quite. Something older and more specific, the expression of a man who has spent decades anticipating threats and has just discovered that one arrived through a door he thought was locked. She looked at the photographs more carefully. The building in the background of several images had a distinctive architectural detail, a curved glass facade with horizontal striping that she had seen before. She was trying to place it when Roman said quietly, "That's the Whitmore Building." She knew the Whitmore Building. Everyone in New York's financial community knew it. It was the kind of address that serious money used when it wanted to be taken seriously. 42 floors, marble lobby. The kind of location that communicated permanence and institutional weight. She had attended 2 events there, both times as Grant's companion. The Whitmore Building, she said, and heard the uncertainty in her own voice. 3rd floor, Roman said. Suites 312 through 318. He picked up one of the photographs and looked at it for a moment. Darius Pendleton's offices are on the 3rd floor of the Whitmore Building. The room went very quiet. Hale made a sound that was not quite words. He cleared his throat and tried again. Roman, the man in the photographs with Pendleton, the one whose face is partially visible in the 3rd image. He stopped. Say it, Roman said. I've worked alongside this man for 11 years, Hale said. Could be mistaken. The angle is poor and the resolution isn't. Bernard, Roman's voice did not rise. It dropped, and the drop was more effective than volume would have been. Say the name. Hale looked at the table. Then he looked up. Marcus Vane. Evelyn did not know the name, but she saw what it did to Roman, and that was sufficient. Roman's hands, which had been resting flat on the table, pressed down briefly with enough force that she saw the tendons emerge along the backs of them. A controlled, isometric response that a person used when they needed to put physical force somewhere that would not cause visible damage. His face did not change. His eyes went to a place slightly above and beyond Hale's shoulder, and he stayed there for a moment, in whatever internal space a man went to when the information he had just received required rapid and complete reassessment of a very large number of things. Marcus Vane, Evelyn said. Who is he? My operations director, Roman said. 18 years. The number landed. 18 years. 1 year longer than the fraud Evelyn had traced in the documents. She looked at the financial records spread across the table, the consulting contracts, the threshold structuring, the 4 shell companies registered through Pendleton's firm, and felt the architecture of it click into place with a cold mechanical precision that was almost physical. The fraud wasn't designed around Grant's habits, she said. Not originally. She heard herself say it and knew it was right before she finished the thought. Grant has only been in a senior executive role for what, 4 years? 5, Roman said. He was looking at her now. The pattern goes back at least 18 months in what I found in my morning. But if Marcus Vane has been managing operations for 18 years, the original infrastructure, the relationships with Pendleton, the registration structure of those companies that started years before Grant was in a position to provide the approvals. She looked at the photographs. At the 2 men beneath the concrete overhang, Grant was the latest mechanism, not the first one. Roman pulled out the chair and sat down again heavily, and it was the most human thing she had seen him do. The weight of it, the particular gravity of a man absorbing a betrayal that was not abstract but personal, operational, woven into the daily fabric of 18 years, was visible in a way he would not have permitted if he had been fully in control of what his body was communicating. How long has Pendleton had the authority to register entities on the family's behalf? Evelyn asked Hale. Hale's throat worked. Broadly, 20 years. Roman granted general authority in 20 years, Evelyn said. She looked at Roman. Marcus Vane joined 18 years ago. 2 years after Pendleton received broad registration authority, Roman said. His voice was flat now. The particular flatness of a mind working at high speed beneath a deliberately controlled surface. Someone introduced them, Evelyn said. Or Pendleton was already positioned, and Vane was placed afterward. Either way, the relationship predates any of what I found in the documents by years. She paused. Roman, how much does Marcus Vane know about your operations? Total operations. Not just the financial side. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than any previous silence in the room. Hale looked at his briefcase. Roman looked at the middle distance. And in that silence, Evelyn understood, without being told, that the answer to her question was everything. Marcus Vane, operations director for 18 years, knew everything. Roman stood again. He moved to the window. He stood there with his back to the room and his hands clasped behind him, and Evelyn watched the set of his shoulders and understood that she was witnessing a man restructuring his entire understanding of the last 2 decades, recalibrating what was compromised and what was safe and how wide the exposure ran. I need to reach 3 people, Roman said. He did not turn around. Before anything else happens, before anyone else is contacted, before Vane has any indication that we have this, he turned. His face had settled into something that Evelyn had no existing category, for it was the expression of a man who had decided to be entirely cold, entirely operational, entirely stripped of the things that made him a father or a person with a history. She had heard the phrase in her head before, a man who ruled through fear. This was the first time she had seen what that actually looked like, from the inside. Bernard, you do not leave this estate today. Your phone stays in that briefcase. You call no one. Hale nodded. He looked relieved to be given an instruction rather than left to his own judgment. Evelyn. Roman looked at her. The coldness in his expression was not directed at her, but it was present in the room and she felt it regardless, the way you felt weather even when it wasn't aimed at you. What you found in those accounts, is there a complete enough record in this room right now to document the scheme independently? Without anything from Pendleton's office or Vane's files. She looked at the documents. She thought about what she had traced and what she had inferred and where the gaps were. 60%, she said, enough to establish the pattern and the beneficiary companies. Not enough to prove individual authorization for each transaction. What would give you the rest? Grant's full approval records. Not just the initialed summaries, the underlying request documents that each approval was responding to. Those would show who submitted each consulting contract for authorization. If Vane was the submitting party on those contracts, that closes the loop. Roman looked at Hale, Grant's approval files. Full record, 18 months minimum. Can you access them without going through the main system? There's an offline backup, Hale said slowly. Roman, if we pull those files outside of the standard access protocol, Vane's system monitors will. I know what they'll do, Roman said. That's why I'm asking if there's a way around them. Hale looked uncomfortable. The backup exists. I've always maintained one. Independently. It was a precaution I put in place years ago without announcing it. He paused. Without announcing it to anyone. Roman looked at him for a long moment. You had concerns, I had a feeling, 3 years ago. Something in the quarterly reconciliation didn't sit right, and I couldn't locate the source. I mentioned it to Vane, and he walked me through an explanation that satisfied me at the time. Hale's voice had developed a subtle tremor. I should have pushed further. I know that. You should have come to me. Yes. Hale's voice was barely above a murmur. I know. Roman absorbed this. He did not offer absolution, and he did not condemn, which was, Evelyn thought, more honest than either response would have been. He simply moved forward, because moving forward was the only option that served any useful purpose. Get the backup. Bring it here. Use the private exit from this wing. Hale gathered his briefcase. He hesitated at the door. Roman, if Vane already knows we have the photographs, if that's why they were sent, to force movement before we're ready, then we're already operating on his timeline, Roman said, which means we need to stop being careful and start being fast. He looked at Hale steadily. Go, Hale went. The door closed. The room was quiet. Evelyn looked at the documents, then at Roman, who was standing very still in a way that had moved beyond composure into something she could only describe as controlled burning, the particular stillness of a person who is expending enormous energy to not move at the speed their instincts were demanding. Grant needs to know about Vane, she said. Grant needs to know about nothing until I've spoken to him myself. Roman's voice was level. He will react. He always reacts before he thinks. Right now, a reaction is the most dangerous thing in this room. He's in the study waiting. I know where he is. Evelyn looked at the photographs, at the two men beneath the concrete overhang. The face that Hale had identified as Marcus Vane, partially turned, the jaw and the profile visible enough to confirm what someone who knew him would recognize. The photographs were sent to Hale's home address, she said. Not to you, why? Roman looked at her sharply. It was the look of a man who had already asked himself this question and had an answer he did not like. Someone wanted Hale to be the one to bring this to you, Evelyn continued. Not a stranger, not anonymously to your address. Through Hale, who you trust, who you would listen to, whose presence in the room would add weight to the information. She paused. The question is whether the person who sent those photographs is trying to help you or maneuvering you into a specific response. Roman was quiet for a long moment. You think it could be both? I think people rarely do one thing at a time. She held his gaze. Someone with access to that level of surveillance of Pendleton and Vane photographs taken at distance. A position that required advanced knowledge of the meeting location that is not a casual observer. That is someone who has been watching this situation develop for a significant amount of time and has chosen this particular moment to surface. Which means they've been deciding when to move, Roman said. And they moved now, the day after Grant's announcement. The morning after I arrived here. She looked at the documents and then back at him. Is it possible that someone knew you would bring me here? The question sat in the air between them. Roman's expression did not change, but his eyes moved over her face with an intensity that was slightly different from anything she had seen from him before, not the evaluating attention of someone deciding how much to trust her, but the particular focus of someone working out whether a piece of information they thought they held alone had a wider circulation than they understood. I've told no one about you, he said. You had a car waiting outside the hotel. You had a room prepared. You had clothes in my size. You had a document with my name on it dated yesterday. She kept her voice even. Roman, someone knew you were expecting me last night. He turned away from her and walked to the window again. He stood there for a long time. So outside, the grounds of the estate were pale and bare in the November morning, the old trees standing in their rows, the iron gate at the far edge of the property closed. She watched his reflection in the glass and saw the thing his face did when he was not managing it for an audience. The deep and specific exhaustion of a man who has been building a wall for decades and has just learned that someone has been living inside it. Margaret, he said very quietly. Evelyn went very still. She's worked here for 22 years, he said. He did not turn around. She manages the household. She manages the calendar. She knows within a certain range when I bring people here and in what circumstances." He paused. "I don't believe Margaret is working with Vane. I do believe that someone who wanted to know about my movements could have found ways to observe the household without Margaret knowing she was observed." "Then Vane may already know I'm here," Evelyn said. "Possibly, and he knows what I found in those documents. He knows I brought an outside analyst to review the accounts. He doesn't know what she found, not yet." Roman turned from the window. His face was controlled again, the burning was still there, but it was further underneath, banked deliberately. "He will find out within hours, perhaps less. Then the 60% I have is going to have to move fast," Evelyn said. She turned back to the documents and began organizing them into a working order that could be photographed and documented quickly. Her hands moved without tremor. The clarity that came with genuine crisis was something she had always been able to rely on, the particular calm of a mind that functioned best when the margin for error was small enough to concentrate it. "When Hale gets back with the approval files, I need 2 hours with them. That gives us the submitting party documentation. With that, the pattern is complete enough to present to an investigator." "Specific investigator," Roman said. He crossed the room and stood at the table beside her, looking at the document she was organizing. "One who doesn't run through channels Vane has access to." "Do you have one?" "I have someone who operates at a level where Vane's reach doesn't extend." He paused. "The question is whether I can reach them before Vane understands what we're doing. Then we should stop talking about doing it and start doing it." Roman looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but a recognition that was almost physical in its directness. "You're not frightened," she said. "I'm frightened," she said. "I'm just faster than I am frightened." He almost smiled. Again it was brief. Again it did not reach his eyes. Again it was not unkind. He moved toward the door and then stopped. He turned back to her. "Evelyn, the document I prepared." She had set it to the side when Hale walked in. It was still there unsigned, the pen beside it, where she had left it. "I know it stands," Roman said. "Whatever happens today, whatever the next hours look like, the offer stands. But I want you to understand something that I didn't say clearly enough this morning." She waited. "If you sign that document," he said, "you are not simply an advisor to this family. You are inside it. Marcus Vane is a dangerous man, not in the dramatic sense, not in the way that makes for a clean story, but in the way that men who have spent 18 years operating within a powerful organization without being caught are always dangerous. He is patient. He is intelligent. He does not make visible mistakes." Roman looked at her steadily. "And as of this morning, you are the primary reason his work is about to become visible." The room was quiet. The November morning was quiet outside. The bare trees stood in their rows, indifferent. "I was already the reason," Evelyn said. "The moment I sat down with those documents, that was already true." "Yes, which means the window in which you could walk away from this without consequence is already closed." She looked at him. "You're telling me that whether I sign or not, I'm already in. You could have mentioned that before you left me alone with the accounts." "Could have," he said. "I didn't." It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had said to her. No justification, no softening. Just the bare fact of it, offered with the matter-of-fact steadiness of a person who believed that honesty without comfort was still preferable to comfort without honesty. Picked up the pen. She signed the document. She placed the pen back in the tray. Roman looked at the signed page for a moment. Then he said 2 hours and left the room. The next 90 minutes had the specific texture of controlled emergency, the kind of work that required total focus, not because the task was difficult, but because difficulty was the only thing keeping other thoughts from the surface. Hale returned with a hard drive 40 minutes after Roman left the room, gray-faced and moving with the compressed urgency of a man who had jogged in a very expensive suit. He handed the drive to Evelyn without ceremony, and she went to work. The approval files were organized exactly as she had hoped and feared, meticulously maintained, which meant that the submitting party documentation was present and precise, and that the name appearing on the submission line of every single consulting contract corresponding to the 4 shell companies was the same name. Marcus Vane, Operations Director, submitted through the standard vendor approval workflow, tagged as routine operational expenditure, designed to appear at the level of Grant's abbreviated review as precisely the kind of ongoing operational cost that a functioning organization generated continuously and invisibly. She documented everything. She was 2/3 through the final batch of approval records when the door opened and Grant walked in. He had not gone to the main study, or he had gone and left. His face was different from the last time she had seen it. Something had been stripped from it. Some layer of the particular performance he had maintained for as long as she had known him, and what was underneath was rawer and less composed and, she thought, more honest than anything she had seen from him since the early years when he had not yet fully constructed the version of himself he intended to inhabit. He looked at the documents, at the hard drive, at Hale, who was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed and an expression of profound misery. Then at Evelyn. "It's Vane," he said. "Yes. My father told you?" "I found it." "Your father confirmed the name." Grant moved into the room and stood at the edge of the table. He looked at the documents with the particular expression of someone who is looking at the physical evidence of their own failure and trying to find a way to stand upright while they do it. "He used my approvals," Grant said. "For how long?" "At least 18 months of what I can confirm. The underlying structure with Pendleton goes back potentially 20 years. Grant was quiet. He looked at his initials on one of the contracts. He was silent for long enough that Evelyn looked up from the documents to check his face, and what she saw there made her set the pen down. He was not performing. He was not constructing a response or calculating the optics or locating the angle that placed him in the best light. He was simply standing there, looking at his own signature on documents that had been used to hollow out the organization. His father had spent 30 years building, and he looked like a man who was, for possibly the first time in his adult life, standing completely inside the reality of his own accountability. "I made it easy for him," Grant said. His voice was flat. "I was proud of being decisive. I didn't read carefully because reading carefully felt like admitting I didn't understand. And Marcus was always there to explain. He always had the context. He always had the answer before I finished the question." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I thought that was competence. His competence." "I didn't ask where it came from, Grant," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "I know you didn't know," she said. "I told your father the same thing. Whatever is coming, that distinction matters." He stared at her. Something in his face cracked slightly and then reassembled, and she thought about 7 years, and the hotel ballroom, and the ring on the table, and the man he was right now versus the man he had been last night. And the distance between those two versions was large enough that she could not entirely locate her own feelings about it. "Why are you started again, after last night? After what I did? Why are you still—" "Because what's right doesn't change based on what happened at a party," she said. "Go find your father. He needs you in this." Grant left. She went back to the documents. She was reaching for the final batch of approval files when she heard it. Not a loud sound, not anything dramatic, just a change in the ambient quality of the house, a slight increase in movement. Voices that were not coming from the study corridor, she knew, but from somewhere else, somewhere farther in the building or the grounds. Particular disruption that rippled through a controlled environment when something had arrived that was not expected. Hale heard it too. He straightened from the wall. He and Evelyn looked at each other. Then Roman appeared in the doorway. He was not alone. Behind him stood a man she had never seen. Early 50s, compact build, the kind of face that did not volunteer information about itself. And behind this man, in the hallway, visible for only a second before the door began to close, was Marcus Vane. Not in a parking garage, not in a surveillance photograph. Here, in the house. Evelyn's body understood the situation before her mind finished processing it. Her hands were already moving, pressing the hard drive to the edge of the table, pushing it toward the back edge. Because if Vane had come here, it was because he knew what she had been doing. And the question was what he was going to do about it. Roman looked at her across the room. His expression told her nothing and everything. He had not brought Vane here. Vane had come, Roman said very carefully. "I'd like you to meet someone." The man beside Roman extended his hand. "Daniel Reyes," he said. "I'm here on behalf of a federal investigation that has been open for approximately 14 months. He looked at the documents on the table. "At the hard drive, at Hale, and it appears," he said, "that you've just given me significantly more than I came for." From the hallway, Marcus Vane stepped fully into the doorway. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that was deeply familiar to everyone in the room except Evelyn, a face that had been trusted and consulted and deferred to for 18 years. He looked at Evelyn. His eyes moved over the documents on the table with a speed and precision that told her he understood exactly what was in them. He looked at the signed engagement document at the edge of the table, her name at the bottom, dated yesterday. And then he looked at Roman, and something passed between them, not words, not gesture, but the specific, annihilating communication of a man who has just understood that a betrayal he believed was invisible has been made completely visible by someone he never considered a threat. "Roman," Vane said. His voice was very steady. It was the steadiness of a man who had spent 18 years being in rooms where steadiness was the only protection he had. "We should talk privately." "We should," Roman said. "But we won't." Vane's eyes went back to Evelyn. She held his gaze without moving. She had been frightened before. She was frightened now. But Roman had said she was faster than her fear, and she intended to make that true because the documents were documented and the hard drive was at the edge of the table. And Daniel Reyes of the 14-month federal investigation was standing in the room, and whatever Marcus Vane had planned for this morning, it had not included any of those things being simultaneously true. He had planned for Grant's approvals and Pendleton's firm and 18 years of patient, invisible work. He had not planned for a woman who found the pattern in 3 hours and signed a document the night before anything broke open, and did not run when the room got dangerous, and was looking at him right now with the particular steadiness of someone who understood that the only move left was to not move at all and let the situation be exactly what the evidence said it was. "I think," Evelyn said quietly, to no one in particular and everyone in the room, that we should probably all sit down. Nobody sat down. Evelyn had said it that quiet, deliberately unremarkable suggestion, the kind of sentence that bought seconds when seconds were the only currency available. But the room did not respond to it, because the room had already moved past the point where suggestions functioned. What existed instead was a specific kind of stillness that she had no prior experience with but understood instinctively, the stillness of multiple people simultaneously calculating how much danger they were in and what their best available movement was. Daniel Reyes had not moved from his position beside Roman. His hand had gone to the inside of his jacket in a motion so practiced it barely registered as motion at all, and it stayed there, not drawing anything, simply establishing geography. Hale was against the far wall, with his briefcase held against his chest, like a shield that both of them understood was not a shield. Grant, who had been moving back toward the study when Vane arrived, had stopped in the corridor, and was now visible through the partially open door, frozen in the particular posture of a man who has walked into a situation his body recognized as dangerous before his mind caught up. And Marcus Vane stood in the doorway. He was not what she had constructed in her imagination during the 3 hours she had spent tracing his work through the documents. She had built something angular and predatory from the surveillance photographs, the partially turned face beneath the concrete overhang, projecting a quality of threat that the photographs could only suggest. In person, he was different. He was a large man, yes, broad and deliberate in the way that men who had spent decades in positions of physical authority carried themselves. But what struck her first was how ordinary his face was. Not distinguished, not cruel, simply a face that had learned over a very long time to present nothing worth reading. He looked at the hard drive at the edge of the table. He looked at Daniel Reyes's hand inside his jacket. He looked at Roman. "You called him," Vane said. "It was not an accusation. It was the flat information-gathering statement of a man who was conducting rapid triage before I arrived." "No," Roman said. "He was already here." Something moved through Vane's expression fast, deeply internal, the kind of recalculation that happened in the space between one breath and the next. His eyes went to the documents on the table, and Evelyn watched him read them the way a person who understood exactly what they were looking at, read them not deciphering, but confirming. He already knew what was there. He had always known what was there, because he was the one who put it there. 18 months, Evelyn said. Vane looked at her. His attention landing on her had a specific weight to it, the attention of someone who was reassessing a variable they had not properly accounted for. "I'm sorry that's how far back I traced the pattern this morning. 18 months. But the structure with Pendleton goes back further, doesn't it?" She kept her voice level. Her heart was hitting the inside of her chest, with a rhythm she was consciously not allowing her face to reflect. "How far back does it actually go?" Vane looked at her for a long moment. The ordinary face was doing something she could not entirely read, not hostility, not exactly, but a kind of appraising focus that made the skin on her arms tighten. "You found this in one morning," he said. "I found the pattern in 3 hours. The confirmation took another 90 minutes. You didn't work here before today." "No, Roman brought you in last night." He looked at Roman. From the gala, something shifted in his expression. The car was waiting before Grant made the announcement. "Yes," Roman said. Vane processed this. She watched him process it and saw the specific moment when the full shape of it reached him, not just the documents, not just Reyes, but the sequence, Roman preparing for her arrival before the gala, predated engagement document, the accounts review this morning. The understanding that what he was looking at was not a reactive investigation triggered by discovery, but a prepared one, moving on a timeline that had been running parallel to his own. "How long?" Vane said to Roman. "Not the documents." "Not Evelyn, Roman. Long enough," Roman said, specific. 14 months, Reyes said. He had not moved. His voice was professional, unhurried, the particular tone of a man who had spent a career in rooms where urgency was a liability. The investigation opened 14 months ago, independent of this family, independent of Mr. Calloway. We identified the shell company structure through a separate financial institution's compliance flagging and worked backward. He paused. We've been working toward a complete picture for over a year. Miss Carter's work this morning gave us the submitting party documentation we were missing. Vane looked at Evelyn again. The look had a different quality now. Not appraising something that was on the near side of dangerous without quite crossing into it. The look of a man who was recalculating what this particular variable meant for his remaining options. You didn't know about the investigation, Evelyn said to him. Not a question. No, he said, and then seemed to realize he had answered. His jaw shifted. Which means your timeline was based on a different set of assumptions, she continued. You thought you had more time, or you thought the risk was coming from a different direction. She looked at the documents. Photographs, the ones sent to Hale this morning. You sent those? The room went very still. Why would I send photographs that implicate myself, Vane said. Because they implicated Pendleton more directly than you, and you were already planning to remove Pendleton from the equation. You needed someone to surface the Pendleton connection on a timeline you controlled through a channel Hale that would create a specific response from Roman. She paused. But you didn't know about the federal investigation, and you didn't know about me, and you didn't know that the response you triggered was going to have significantly more material in it than you anticipated. Vane looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, not entirely controlled. Not broken, nowhere close to broken, but fractured at the edge, the particular fracture of a plan meeting an element it was not designed for. You plan to let Pendleton take the weight, Roman said. His voice had gone to the place it had been earlier, the cold, operational place that made the space around him feel smaller. Cut the external connection, keep the internal structure intact. Redirect suspicion outward, and then rebuild from a cleaner position once the dust settled. Vane said nothing. 18 years, Roman said. The two words had a weight that was not volume. They were simply heavy, the specific gravity of time and proximity, and a betrayal that was not impersonal, but deeply specifically personal. I brought you into this organization when you had nothing. I built your authority. I trusted your assessments for nearly 2 decades. He stopped. Something moved through his face, not grief exactly. Not in front of Vane, but the residue of it, the particular pain of a person who has just had confirmed something they hoped would not be confirmed. How long did you plan to run it? Vane looked at him for a long moment. And then something happened in the room that Evelyn had not anticipated. Vane spoke. Not the controlled, information-managing statements he had been making. Actually spoke with something that was not quite the rawness of confession, but was the next closest thing to it. You were going to retire, Vane said. You've been talking about it for 3 years. Stepping back, reducing your active role, transitioning the operation to the next generation. His voice was flat and even, and it was the evenness of a man who had rehearsed this, not for this room, not for this moment, but in the privacy of his own reasoning over years. Grant is not capable of running this organization. You know that. You have known that for years. The moment you step back and Grant steps forward, everything you built starts to degrade. I have watched that degradation begin already 5 years of Grant's executive authority, and the erosion is visible to anyone paying attention. So you decided to take it, Roman said. I decided to protect it. The distinction in Vane's voice was not defensive, it was genuine, which was almost worse. He believed it. Whatever architecture of justification he had built around 18 years of systematic theft, he had built it so thoroughly and inhabited it so long that it had become indistinguishable from conviction. Every dollar that moved through those contracts was reinvested into operational capacity. The consulting companies were holding structures. The money wasn't gone, Roman. It was repositioned. Into structures you controlled, Reyes said. Into structures that could function independently of Grant Calloway's incompetence. Vane looked at Roman. You built something that matters. I was not going to watch your son dismantle it, because he cannot distinguish between confidence and judgment. The room was breathing. Evelyn could feel it, the specific atmospheric quality of a space where multiple people were managing enormous pressure through the mechanism of very controlled physical stillness. That is, Roman said slowly, the most dangerous kind of wrong. The kind a person commits while believing they are right. Grant moved. He had been in the corridor doorway, and now he was inside the room, and he was not composed. His face had the raw, overexposed quality of someone who had moved past the point where managing his expression was possible. You used my approvals, he said. His voice cracked on the last word, and he did not try to repair it. You built this entire thing around my signature. Around the fact that you knew I wouldn't read carefully enough. He stopped. His throat worked. You didn't build it to protect the organization from me. You built it because you knew I was the perfect person to hide behind. Vane looked at Grant. The look was not unkind. That was the worst part of it. It was not unkind. It was the look of someone who had considered another person thoroughly and found them insufficient, but without malice, the way a structural engineer found a beam insufficient. It was about load-bearing, not hatred. You are not ready to lead this, Vane said. You may never be. Grant's hands had closed into fists at his sides. His knuckles were white. That was not your call to make. Someone had to make it, by stealing from my family, by preserving what your family built while you were busy deciding which socialite to bring to Gallus. The words were delivered without heat, which made them land harder than any shout would have. Vane looked at him steadily. I have watched you for 5 years, Grant. I have watched you approve documents you didn't read. I have watched you make operational decisions based on who was in the room rather than what the data said. I have watched you prioritize the appearance of strength over its actual exercise. He paused. You are exactly what I said. A useful one. Grant took 3 steps across the room, and Reyes moved not dramatically, simply inserting himself into the geometries of the space in a way that made Grant's forward motion stop without physical contact. Grant stopped. He was breathing hard. His face was the face of a man who wanted to do something. His body was being prevented from doing, and who was, in the prevention, being forced to remain with something much harder than physical action, the requirement to stand still inside the truth of what he had just heard. Grant, Evelyn said his name. He looked at her. She shook her head, one small motion. Not now, not like this. He stood still. His jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working. But he stood still. Reyes had moved Marcus Vane back toward the doorway during this exchange, a gradual professional repositioning that had not looked like what it was until it was complete. 2 other men appeared in the corridor behind Vane. She had not heard them arrive, had not heard a car or a door, which meant they had been on the property for longer than the last few minutes, which meant Reyes had come prepared for exactly this contingency. Vane looked at the men behind him. He looked at Roman. His face was doing something. She watched carefully the final, rapid recalculation of a man who has found every exit closed and is deciding whether the closing of exits changes his behavior or only his tactics. The reinvestment records, Vane said to Roman. The documentation of where the funds were repositioned. It exists. All of it. Every dollar is traceable. He was speaking quickly now, not frantically, but with the compressed urgency of someone making a case in a narrowing window. Whatever the federal investigation has built, those records provide the context. The money was not extracted for personal gain. The structures were operational. They were not authorized, Reyes said. They were not authorized through the standard channels, Vane said. That is different. The law, Reyes said, pleasantly, disagrees. Vane looked at Roman one final time. The ordinary face had, in the last 60 seconds, become something she would remember for a long time. Not the face of a villain, because that would have been easier, but the face of a man who had been genuinely convinced of his own necessity and was now standing in the evidence of what that conviction had cost. I kept this organization alive, he said. Whatever else is true, I kept it alive. You hollowed it out, Roman said, and called the hollow a structure. Reyes spoke to the men in the corridor. They moved. Vane went with them without physical resistance, which was the most chilling thing about it, the absence of spectacle, the clean, almost administrative quality of a man who had operated invisibly for 18 years and was now, even in this moment, maintaining the professional composure that was the only identity he had. The door closed. The room after Vane was different from the room before him. Pressure dropped but did not disappear, it redistributed, settling into the bodies of the people who remained with the specific weight of aftermath. Hale sat down in the chair he had been standing behind and put his face in his hands, not dramatically, just the quiet collapse of a man's legs deciding they had been doing enough. Grant stood where Reyes had stopped him, not moving, his hands still loosely fisted at his sides, his breathing gradually slowing. Roman stood in the center of the room and said nothing for a long time. Evelyn looked at the documents on the table. She looked at the hard drive. She looked at the signed engagement document at the edge of the table with her name on it, dated the day before any of this existed in its current form. She thought about the sequence of it, Roman, preparing that document. Before the gala, before Grant's announcement, before the car and the drive and the photographs and the 3 hours with the accounts. He had known something was structurally wrong inside his organization. He had been looking for a way to see it clearly for longer than any of them had said aloud. She had been the instrument, she understood now. Not manipulated, she did not believe she had been manipulated. Because manipulation required misrepresentation, and Roman had not misrepresented anything, had in fact been more consistently honest with her in 36 hours than most people managed in years. But she had been chosen, selected with the precision of a man who understood what he needed and spent 11 years confirming that she was it. And she had walked into the car and into the house and into the accounts review with what she had believed was her own volition, and it had been her own volition, and it had also been exactly what Roman planned. She was not certain how she felt about that. She suspected she would be working it out for a long time. Reyes came back into the room. He looked at Roman. He looked at Evelyn. "We need to talk about the next 48 hours, he said. He put a card on the table. "Both of you, give us a minute," Roman said. Reyes looked at him, then at Evelyn. Then he left again, and the door was not entirely closed. And Evelyn heard the low sound of voices in the corridor beyond it, the particular professional murmur of people managing a situation. Roman looked at his son. Grant had not moved from the spot where Reyes had stopped him. He was looking at the floor with the particular downward focus of a person who needs to look at something that is not another face. His breathing had steadied, but the rawness was still visible in the set of his shoulders, the slight forward pitch of his head. "Grant," Roman said. Grant looked up. "Sit down." Grant sat. He sat in the chair nearest him, which happened to be the chair Hale had vacated, and he sat with the particular heaviness of someone who has had a significant portion of their structural self-concept removed in a short period of time and has not yet developed a substitute. Roman stood in front of his son. He did not touch him. He simply stood there, close enough that the relationship between them was visible in the space, the particular geometry of a father and a son in a room where something irreversible had just happened. "He was right," Grant said. His voice was quiet about the approvals, about how I processed them. He designed it around something real. Yes, I should have read them. Yes, I didn't read them because reading them felt like admitting I needed to. Grant stopped. His jaw worked. I hired people to understand things I didn't want to be seen not understanding. Marcus was always the one who had the context. He was always 3 steps ahead of the question, and I told myself that was competence, and never asked why he was always 3 steps ahead. He looked at his hands. He was 3 steps ahead because he wrote the question. Roman was quiet for a moment. "You are telling me things I know," he said. "What I need to know is whether you understand them, not as facts about the past, as facts about who you intend to be." Grant looked up at his father. Something in his face was naked in a way she had not seen from him before and found herself looking away from briefly. The way you looked away from pain that was private. "I don't know yet," Grant said. "I think I need to find out." It was the most honest sentence she had ever heard him speak. Roman looked at his son for a long moment. Then he put his hand on Grant's shoulder. One firm, brief contact. He released it and stepped back. "All right," he said. He moved toward the door. He stopped and looked at Evelyn. "Come." They went to the main study together, where Reyes was waiting with 2 other agents she had not seen before, both of them with the careful-faced professional anonymity of federal investigators who had learned to keep their expressions in a neutral position while covering difficult ground. On the table in the study were several new documents that had not been in the room before, printed pages with agency headers, case reference numbers, sections marked with translucent tabs. Reyes was direct. The investigation had 14 months of work behind it. What Evelyn had produced in the last 3 hours filled the central gap, the direct connection between the shell companies and the internal submission authority. Vane's cooperation, or the lack of it, would determine the timeline for the next steps. Pendleton had been on the investigation's radar for 6 months. His connection to the shell company registrations was documented, but the internal authorization chain had been unverifiable until this morning. The question now, Reyes said, looking at both of them, is how the Calloway organization handles the next 48 hours publicly. Vane's absence will be noticed. The people who work under him will notice it first, and some of them have been operating with sufficient proximity to his methods that their own situations are uncertain. He looked at Roman. "You need a functioning operations structure by tomorrow morning. Who covers it?" Roman was quiet. Evelyn recognized the silence, not indecision, but the particular focus of a man sorting through a large amount of information rapidly. "Bernard Hale manages the legal interface with your office," he said finally. "Operations is more complex." He looked at Evelyn. She felt the look before she processed it. "No," she said. "You understand the accounts better than anyone in this building who doesn't have a federal case interest. I've been here for 36 hours. You found the fraud in 3. That is not the same thing as managing an operations division. I'm not asking you to manage it permanently. I'm asking you to be present and functional for the next 48 hours while we establish who in that division can be trusted and who cannot. He looked at her steadily. You signed the document. She had signed it 20 minutes ago, with a pen from a tray at her right hand, in a room where Bernard Hale was watching from the wall, and the decision had felt clear and confirmed in a way that decisions sometimes did when they arrived at the end of a long process, rather than the beginning of one. I signed it as a strategic partner, she said, not an operations director. The distinction exists on the document. It does not currently exist in the building. She looked at Reyes. What do you need from this office in the next 48 hours? Operational continuity, he said. The investigation needs the organization to function, normally enough that the network Vane was maintaining doesn't detect disruption and begin protective action. Calloway operation visibly collapses. The people receiving the shell company funds get warning. You need the organization to look intact while you close the external connections. Exactly. She looked at the study. She looked at the documents on the table with their agency headers. She looked at Roman, who was watching her with the contained, patient attention of a man who had made his bet a long time ago and was simply waiting to see if the odds paid out. She thought about what Vane had said, standing in the doorway with 18 years behind him. I was not going to watch your son dismantle it, because he cannot distinguish between confidence and judgment. She thought about what was wrong with that sentence. Not the assessment of Grant. She could not honestly disagree with the assessment of Grant. What was wrong was the conclusion he had drawn from it. The assumption that the response to Grant's insufficiency was private seizure rather than transparent correction. The assumption that his judgment, unchecked and unshared, was preferable to the organization's vulnerability. She had spent 7 years adjacent to one man who trusted his own judgment exclusively. She had just spent 36 hours watching the aftermath of a second one. All right, she said, 48 hours. Roman nodded. He did not say thank you. She was beginning to understand that was not a failure of gratitude, but a form of respect. The recognition that she had made a choice, and choices at this level did not need to be thanked. They needed to be honored by the people around them, through the quality of their own action. Reyes distributed assignments with the efficient economy of a man who had been planning this specific morning for a long time, and was relieved to finally be inside it. Hale would manage document transfer to the federal team. The 2 agents she hadn't met would begin working through the operations division personnel files. She and Roman would handle the internal communications, the careful, measured reassurance to division leads that operations were stable, that Marcus Vane's absence was related to a personnel matter being handled at the executive level, that normal function was expected and expected now. She spent the next 4 hours in rooms she had not seen before, moving through the operational infrastructure of an organization that was simultaneously being held together and carefully taken apart. She spoke to department heads whose faces she had to learn in real time, whose names she absorbed and filed with the same focused speed she applied to documents. She said enough to be credible and not enough to alarm, and she watched the people she spoke to for the specific signals she had learned to read in years of operating in rooms where the official version and the actual situation were reliably different. 2 of the people she spoke to were problematic. She noted them separately, noted specifically what they said and how they said it, and which questions they did not ask that she would have expected them to ask. And she brought her notes to Reyes in the late afternoon without being asked, and he read them with the focused attention of a man finding something that matched a pattern he already had. Roman was with her for most of it. Not visibly, he did not enter the rooms with her, because his presence at department level would have amplified rather than dampened the tension, but present in the building, in the corridor, reachable and aware. She understood, gradually, the specific architecture of how he operated, the way authority at his level functioned most effectively at one remove from direct management, the particular discipline of a man who had learned that the most powerful thing he could communicate was strategic stillness. In the late afternoon, they had 40 minutes alone in the main study while Reyes was conducting interviews in the operations wing. It was the first extended silence they had shared since morning. Roman stood at the window. He seemed to think better standing. She had noticed, or perhaps he simply needed the horizon. And Evelyn sat at the table with the documents and her notes and her 3rd cup of coffee since noon. The 2 people I flagged, she said. I know one of them. The other is a surprise. The second one is more dangerous, she said. The first one is obvious enough that Vane probably kept him at a distance to protect himself. The second one has been careful. The questions she didn't ask were very specific in their absence. Roman turned from the window. Yes. She's been in the organization for 7 years. He paused. Grant hired her. Evelyn looked at her notes. She asked me 3 operational questions that were entirely reasonable and one that was not. She asked whether the operations review would extend to vendor payment processing. She looked up. Not current vendors, vendor payment processing as a system. She was asking whether we'd found the mechanism. She was asking how close we were. Evelyn set down the cup. She's not a central player. She's positioned at the edge of the payment structure, in a place where she could either facilitate or flag. Vane needed her not to flag. Roman was quiet. How did he keep her? I don't know yet, but it wasn't purely financial. Her questions were too anxious for someone who is simply being paid. She's afraid of something specific. She paused. That might be useful. Roman looked at her across the study. The afternoon light had moved since morning, and it came now from a lower angle, catching the specific exhaustion in both their faces that 3 cups of coffee had not fully addressed. You've done this before, he said. Not accounts. This, reading rooms, managing situations where the information has to be extracted without revealing that you're extracting it. I grew up with a mother who ran a legal aid office on a nonprofit budget, Evelyn said. You learn to read what people aren't saying when the people you work with have every reason to be afraid of authority. Roman absorbed this. She taught you. She was the example. I don't think she taught it deliberately. She just did it every day in every room she walked into. Evelyn looked at the table. She believed that most people were trying to do the right thing and just needed someone to make it slightly safer than the alternative. I've found that's true more often than not. And when it isn't true, then you note them specifically and bring the notes to the federal investigator. Roman was quiet for a moment. Then the foundation, he said. She looked up. The charter. I want you to know that the circumstances of today don't change it. The Calloway Foundation was planned before the gala. Before last night. You arrived here, he held her gaze. What happened today, finding the fraud, the investigation, Marcus, none of that is the reason for the foundation. The foundation exists because I looked at what this family has taken from this city over 30 years, and I wanted to begin returning it in a form that mattered. He paused. I want you to lead it. For the reasons that were true before today, not because of today. She had not thought about the foundation since morning. She had not had the cognitive space for it. But now, in the late afternoon quiet of the study, she found it again, the charter, the name on the line, the programs it described. Legal assistance, emergency housing, career support for women who had built their stability around someone else's structure and found themselves on the outside of it when that structure was removed. I know someone who would want to be involved, she said. She ran a legal aid office for 23 years. She's retired now and she finds retirement boring. Roman looked at her. Your mother. She built something that mattered once. She'd want to build it again. Evelyn looked at the documents. She'd also tell you exactly what was wrong with your organizational management, and she would not frame it diplomatically. He meant it. A knock at the door. Reyes. He came in with a legal pad covered in notes and the focused, compressed energy of a man who had developed significant new information in the last 4 hours. He looked at Roman, then at Evelyn. Elena Marsh, he said. Yes, Evelyn said. He looked at her. How? She asked a question she shouldn't have known to ask. Reyes sat down. We found a secondary account structure, smaller than the main scheme. A parallel track that Vane appears to have set up as a fail-safe operational funding that would have continued functioning if the primary structure was disrupted. He put the legal pad on the table. Marsh was the account signatory. She was his backup, Evelyn said. She was his continuation plan. Reyes looked at the legal pad, which means she knew about the primary scheme. She was positioned to continue it if Vane was removed. She would have needed to understand the architecture to function as a replacement. He paused. She is not a peripheral player. She is the redundancy. Roman stood very still. She's in the building right now. She looked up, and she knows something is wrong. She hasn't attempted to leave, which tells me she doesn't know how compromised she is. She thinks there's still a version of this where she walks away clean. He looked at Evelyn. I'd like you to speak with her again. The room went quiet. You want to use the fact that she spoke to me earlier, Evelyn said. I want to use the fact that she doesn't know who you are or what you found. To her, you are Roman Calloway's new strategic partner who asked some operational questions this afternoon. You are not in her mind, the person who built the case. He looked at her steadily. I need her to say something she doesn't know she's saying. That's an interview, Evelyn said. That's an investigative interview. It's a conversation, Reyes said, between 2 people in the same building, one of whom happens to have a federal agent listening from the adjacent room. Evelyn looked at Roman. He did not tell her to do it. He did not tell her not to. He simply returned her gaze with the measured, unperforming steadiness of a man who had decided that this particular decision belonged entirely to her. She thought about the signed document on the table in the accounts room. She thought about what she had told Roman that morning, about her mother's legal aid office and the practice of making the right thing slightly safer than the alternative. She thought about 18 years of Vane's careful architecture and the secondary account and the woman in the operations division who had asked about payment processing, with an anxiety that was specific and contained, and pointed at something she was terrified of losing. She thought about the fact that Elena Marsh was a person, and that persons in complicated situations had reasons, and that reasons sometimes contained exits that fear had blocked from view. "I'll speak with her," Evelyn said, "but I need to know what you want from the conversation. Not what you want me to get her to say, what you actually need." Reyes looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was adjusting his approach in real time. "I need to know if the secondary account has been activated in the last 24 hours, he said. "If it has, there are external parties who may already have received notification that the primary structure is compromised. If it hasn't, we have time. She won't tell me that directly." "No. But if you ask her about the operational timeline for the payment processing system specifically, whether any manual overrides have been initiated recently, she will either answer with the specific technical vocabulary of someone who knows exactly what she's talking about, or she'll deflect in a way that tells you the same thing." Evelyn stood. She gathered her notes. She did not pick up the coffee. She needed her hands to be empty and her face to be uncluttered by props. She had done this before, she realized. Not with stakes this high, not with federal agents in the adjacent room, but the mechanism was the same one she had used in a dozen difficult conversations in the Hargrove Foundation. Offices, the practice of walking into a room where someone was afraid and creating enough safety for the truth to have somewhere to land. She was almost at the door when Roman spoke. "Evelyn." She turned. He looked at her across the study, this woman who had walked into his car 36 hours ago, with nothing but a silver dress and 7 years of discarded belief, who had found a fraud in 3 hours and signed a document in a moment of clarity and spent the subsequent afternoon holding an organization together through the mechanism of total, precise attention. "Be careful," he said. It was not the careful of a man managing an asset. It was the careful of a person who meant it specifically about a specific person in a specific room. "I will," she said. She went down the corridor and turned left toward the operations wing where Elena Marsh was still at her desk, and the afternoon light was failing outside the estate's high windows. And somewhere in the city, Grant Calloway was sitting in a study, thinking about the difference between confidence and judgment. And somewhere in federal custody, Marcus Vane was thinking about 18 years and what they amounted to now that they were visible. And Evelyn Carter, who had walked out of a ballroom 20 hours ago, with nothing, was walking down a corridor toward a woman who was afraid, carrying only the practiced conviction that most people were trying to do the right thing and just needed someone to make it slightly safer than the alternative. She knocked on the open door of Elena Marsh's office. Elena looked up. Her face did the thing Evelyn had cataloged earlier, the rapid internal recalibration of a person deciding how much to give away, and then it settled into the professional composure that she had maintained all afternoon like a second skin. "Ms. Carter," she said, "did you need something else?" "I had a follow-up question," Evelyn said, "about the payment processing system." She sat down across from the desk without being invited, which was deliberate, the specific body language of a person who had authority in the room and was not performing it. "The manual override protocols. Can you walk me through the last time one was initiated?" Elena Marsh's left hand, resting on the desk, moved approximately 3 centimeters toward the keyboard before she stopped it. Elena Marsh's left hand stopped 3 centimeters from the keyboard and did not move again. It was the stillness after the almost movement that told Evelyn everything, not the reach the stopping. A person with nothing to hide would have moved the hand to the keyboard and pulled up whatever log existed for manual overrides and walked through it with the professional ease of someone who had nothing to locate or conceal. A person with something to hide would have deflected, asked why the question was relevant, redirected. Elena Marsh did neither. She stopped her own hand and then sat with the stopped hand, and the stopped breath of a person who had just heard something they understood was not actually a question. "Ms. Marsh," Evelyn said. She kept her voice even, the way her mother had always kept her voice, even in the legal aid office, when a client was deciding whether to trust her. Not warm, because warmth at the wrong moment read as strategy, but level, the specific register of someone who had already decided not to judge and was waiting for the other person to believe that. I'm not asking you to incriminate yourself. I'm asking because if the secondary account was activated in the last 24 hours, there are people outside this building who are going to make decisions in the next few hours. It will be significantly harder to walk back than whatever decision you make right now. Elena looked at her. Her face had the quality of someone performing composure from the outside in, rather than the inside out. The surface was held together, but underneath it something was shaking. I don't know what secondary account you're referring to, Elena said. Yes, you do. Evelyn did not say it harshly. She said it the way you said something to a person who needed to hear it in a voice that was not accusing them. And I think you know that I know, which is why your hand went to the keyboard before you could stop it. You were going to check whether something had gone through, which means something was scheduled to go through, which means the question isn't whether the account exists. The question is whether it's been activated. Elena's breathing was audible, small and controlled and audible. Her left hand was still on the desk, still in the place it had stopped, and she was looking at Evelyn with the specific expression of a person standing at the edge of a decision that is simultaneously obvious and terrifying. If I talk to you, Elena said, very quietly, what happens? I can't promise you anything, Evelyn said. I'm not in a position to make deals. What I can tell you is that there is a federal agent in the room adjacent to this one, and he has been building this case for 14 months. And the difference between a peripheral figure who cooperated and a knowing participant who didn't is not a small difference. Elena closed her eyes. She kept them closed for approximately 4 seconds. When she opened them, something had shifted, not resolved, not relaxed, but moved to a different location inside her. The way an enormous weight moves when the person carrying it finally decides to set it down, even if setting it down is going to hurt. It was activated at 6 this morning, Elena said. Before I came in, before I knew, she stopped. I received an automated notification at 5:47. Marcus had set up a trigger. If he didn't confirm a check-in code by 6, the secondary account initiated a transfer sequence. She paused. I didn't activate it. I received a notification that it had activated itself. How much? 3.2 million, staged across 9 transactions to 7 different accounts. Have the transactions completed, 2 of them. She looked at her desk. Keyboard she had almost reached. The other 7 are in a processing queue. They would complete between now and tomorrow morning. Evelyn stood. Don't touch anything, she said, not harshly. Don't access the account. Don't log into any system. Don't send any communications. Just stay here. She walked out of the office and back down the corridor to the study where Reyes was waiting. And she told him in 2 sentences what Elena Marsh had told her. And she watched Reyes's focused, professional face make the rapid transition from intent listening to action in the specific way of someone who has just received the piece of information that shifts a static situation into a moving one. He was on the phone before she finished the second sentence. The next 3 hours were not dramatic in the way that the morning had been dramatic. They were the drama of precise, coordinated action conducted at speed. Reyes's team working through the transaction queue with the technical efficiency of people who had rehearsed this category of intervention, the 2-stage transactions being flagged and held at the institutional level through channels that moved faster than Evelyn had known was possible. The 7 pending transfers, frozen in the processing queue through a federal order that Reyes produced with the unhurried confidence of a man who had prepared it before he arrived at the estate that morning. Elena Marsh spent 90 minutes in a room with 2 of Reyes's agents and emerged looking the way people looked when they had said out loud everything they had been carrying alone for a significant amount of time, gutted and lighter, simultaneously. The specific emotional residue of a confession that was also a kind of relief. She was not arrested. She was told explicitly and carefully what she was and was not permitted to do in the subsequent period, and she listened with the total, exhausted attention of a person who has used up all available resistance and is grateful, finally, for an instruction simple enough to follow. By 9 o'clock in the evening, Reyes gathered Roman, Evelyn, and Hale in the main study and told them where things stood. Primary fraud was fully documented. The secondary account had been intercepted with 2 completed transactions and 7 prevented. Darius Pendleton had been contacted by federal agents at his home at 7:15 and had, according to Reyes, made the decision to cooperate within approximately 11 minutes, which was, Reyes noted without inflection, faster than most people in his position managed. Marcus Vane had said nothing beyond his name and his attorney's name, which was consistent with 18 years of operating under the understanding that silence was the only position worth holding when you had nothing to gain from speech. The investigation would continue for months. There would be hearings and document production, and the slow, grinding legal process through which large financial crimes became officially visible. Roman and the Calloway organization were targets of nothing they were. In the precise language Reyes used, the organization from which funds were extracted without authorization, which was a different legal position than being the organization that extracted them. Hale, who had been listening with the compressed, careful attention of a man reconstructing his understanding of 23 years of professional life, asked 3 precise legal questions. Reyes answered them. Hale wrote the answers down in the leather notebook he had produced from his briefcase, and when he was done writing, he looked at Roman and said quietly, "I should have come to you 3 years ago." "Yes," Roman said, "but you're here now." It was the same response he had given Grant that morning, Evelyn noticed. The same construction, the same refusal of absolution, paired with the same refusal of condemnation. She was beginning to understand that this was not rhetorical consistency but moral consistency, a man who held the same standard across different people regardless of how much he cared about them, which was both harder and more respectful than the alternative. Reyes and his team left the estate at 10:15. The house settled into the particular quiet that follows the departure of people who were carrying something large. Margaret appeared from the kitchen wing with food that she placed on the dining room table without comment, the same unhurried practicality she had maintained throughout a day that had been, for the household, the equivalent of a controlled demolition followed by the requirement to remain functional. Roman sat at the head of the table. Grant sat to his left, which was where Grant had always sat, the unconscious geography of family dinners. Evelyn sat across from Grant, which was where she sat, because it was the available chair, and she was aware that this arrangement, the 3 of them, this table, this food, this specific quiet had a shape she had not anticipated and was not certain she was ready to inhabit. They ate in the silence of people who had used most of the day's available words on things that mattered and were now in the presence of a meal that mattered differently, in the older and more basic way that food mattered when people needed to simply continue. Grant ate half of what was on his plate and then set down his fork. "I called Claudine," he said. Neither Roman nor Evelyn responded immediately. The word sat in the air, and its weight was not dramatic, but it was there. "I told her I'd made a decision I couldn't stand behind," Grant said. He was looking at his plate. "I told her that what I said at the gala wasn't fair to her either. She deserved someone who chose her because he actually wanted to, not because he was performing a version of himself that required a specific audience." He paused. She wasn't surprised, which was its own kind of information. Roman looked at his son. "How did she take it? Better than I deserved." Grant picked up his fork and then set it down again. "She said she'd sensed that I was running from something rather than toward her, that she'd told herself it would settle once we were public." He looked up. "She was being generous. She's more perceptive than I gave her credit for." "Most people are," Roman said. Grant looked at Evelyn. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. What I did at the gala it was wrong in a way I didn't fully understand until I was standing in that room this morning watching someone explain how they spent 18 years exploiting the specific version of me I chose to be." He held her gaze. "I don't want you to forgive me tonight. I'm not sure I've earned the version of me that forgiveness would be responding to. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I did, not as a fact about the past, as information about who I am and what I need to change." Evelyn looked at him across the table. This man she had loved for 7 years, who was sitting in his father's dining room on the worst day of his adult life, eating half a plate of food and telling the truth with the unpracticed effort of someone who was doing it for the first time in a language he didn't yet speak fluently. It was imperfect and sincere, and it was more than she had expected from him, and she said so. "I believe you," she said. "That's enough for tonight." Grant nodded. He picked up his fork again. He ate. Roman looked at Evelyn across the table with the look she was beginning to be able to read, not the evaluating look of the first night, not the confirming look of the morning, but something quieter and more current, the look of a man who was in the present moment of a specific evening with a specific person and was not managing it toward any future purpose. "Your mother," he said. "Tell me about her." So Evelyn told him about her mother. She told him about the legal aid office on the 4th floor of a building in Brooklyn that had a window that faced an air shaft, and a waiting room that was always full, and a staff of 3 that functioned, like 7 through sheer coordinated determination. She told him about the clients her mother had represented, people in impossible situations, who needed someone to stand between them and a system that moved faster and harder than they could manage alone. She told him about the day her mother retired, which had been an event attended by approximately 60 people whose situations her mother had helped resolve over 23 years, and how her mother had stood at the front of the room and cried without apology, which was the first time Evelyn had ever seen her cry, because her mother operated on the principle that the work was more important than the feelings about the work, and had maintained that principle in all circumstances except this one final afternoon when the work was ending and the feelings were larger than the principle. She told him that her mother had been retired for 8 months and had called Evelyn 11 times in those 8 months to tell her about small injustices she had witnessed and could no longer do anything about, and that these calls had a specific quality of frustrated energy that Evelyn recognized as the energy of someone designed for useful work being deprived of it. Roman listened to all of this without interrupting. This was, she had come to understand, the particular quality of his attention that was most difficult to describe, not the performance of listening, but the actual practice of it, the kind that created space for a person to continue rather than filling the space with responsive noise. She sounds, Roman said, when Evelyn finished, like someone who would find the foundation extremely inconvenient and do it anyway. That is the most accurate description of her I have ever heard, Evelyn said. Grant, who had been quietly eating through most of this, looked up. You're building a foundation? I've been building it for 3 years, Roman said. It needed a leader. It has one now. Grant looked at Evelyn. Something moved in his face, not pain, not jealousy, but a more complex thing, the specific expression of a person who is recognizing, in real time, the shape of what he walked away from. Not just Evelyn, not just what Evelyn was, but what he might have understood 3 years earlier if he had been paying a different kind of attention. Calloway Foundation, he said. The foundation is not named after this family, Roman said. I spent considerable time on that decision. The work should carry its own name. Not ours. What will it be called? Grant asked. Roman looked at Evelyn. She had not been consulted on the name. She realized this now, in this dining room, that the charter had contained program descriptions and budget structures and her name on the chair line, but she had not read the name of the foundation itself. She looked at Roman with the specific expression of a person who has just identified a gap. Roman almost smiled. I left that line blank, he said. I thought the chair should choose. The dining room was quiet. The food was mostly finished. Outside, November had fully settled into the grounds. She could feel it through the old windows, the particular cold of a night that was genuinely winter rather than performing it. She thought about what the foundation was for, not abstractly, concretely. Women who had built their lives around structures that had failed. Women who had organized themselves around other people's visions until the vision collapsed or was redirected, and they were left with nothing they could call their own. Women who had kept records in encrypted folders because they understood, even when they hadn't fully articulated it, that self-preservation was not selfishness, but necessity. The margin foundation, she said, because that's where most of the work happens. Not in the center, at the edge where people are trying to hold on. The silence that followed was not the silence of assessment. It was the silence of people recognizing something that was right without requiring explanation. Yes, Roman said, that's it. The next morning came cold and clear, the particular clarity of New York in late November when the sky decided to be blue without qualification. Evelyn woke in the same room she had woken in the previous morning, and the sequence of the last 48 hours arranged itself in her mind with the specific completeness of events that have resolved rather than merely stopped. Not finished, nothing of this scale finished cleanly. And she knew there were months of legal process and organizational reconstruction ahead, months of her own adjustment to a life that looked nothing like the one she had expected to be living, but resolved. The shape of things was visible now. The structure beneath the event was clear. She dressed and went downstairs. Roman was at the breakfast table again. The newspaper was folded to the business section again. Margaret had put coffee on again. The familiarity of the repetition, after 48 hours that had been the opposites of familiar, had a quality she sat with for a moment before she moved toward the table. He stood when she entered, again. She suspected he would always stand, not because it was a performance of courtesy, but because it was for him, simply a practice, the physical expression of an attention that was consistent rather than situational. Grant left early, Roman said. He drove out before 7. He said he had something to do. Do you know what? No. But he went in his own car rather than having someone drive him, which is the first time he's done that in approximately 4 years. I consider it a positive indicator. She sat down. She poured her own coffee. Romans sat across from her, and they ate breakfast in the quiet of two people who had been through something large together and were now on the other side of it, in the particular peace that exists not when difficulty is absent, but when it has been moved through honestly. I need to go home today, she said. I know. There are things I need to attend to. My apartment. Calls I haven't returned. My mother, who has called 3 times since Tuesday night and is going to have opinions about all of this that she will not express diplomatically. I look forward to meeting her, Roman said. She will not make it easy. Good. Evelyn looked at him across the breakfast table. This man she had met in any meaningful sense 48 hours ago, who had been watching her in the specific and documented way for 11 years, who had prepared a document with her name on it before a gala where he knew his son would humiliate her, who had sat in a car outside a hotel and waited for a woman he believed would walk out, because he had spent enough time understanding her to trust that she would. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask the document. The one dated before the gala. She held his gaze. If Grant hadn't made the announcement, if the evening had proceeded normally, and I had gone home with my ring on and nothing had happened, were you going to let it go? Roman was quiet for a moment. No, you would have approached me anyway. I had a different plan for doing it. Slower, more gradual. The gala accelerated a timeline that was already in motion. He looked at his coffee. I was not waiting for Grant to fail. I was waiting for the right moment to offer you a choice that didn't involve you having to sacrifice something to receive it. He paused. The gala removed that possibility. What Grant did that night meant that any approach from me would happen in the context of your loss rather than separate from it. That was not what I intended, but you still had the car there. Because, regardless of context, I was not going to watch you stand in that lobby alone at the end of the evening if I could be there instead. She sat with this. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with the knowledge that a person had been orbiting your life for 11 years with intention, had planned the specific mechanics of an approach, had arranged for contingencies that she had walked into believing were her own decisions. It was not comfortable, and it was also, when she pressed on it, honestly, not wrong. He had never misrepresented anything. He had offered her real information and real choices and had been transparent, at every point when transparency was possible, about what he was doing and why. The discomfort was not with him. The discomfort was with the older, harder question of how much any of us chose the events we believed we were choosing, and how much those events had been shaped by people who saw us before we saw them, and whether that shaping was manipulation or simply the way one person's long attention to another person eventually materialized into circumstance. She did not have a resolved answer to that question. She suspected she would not for a long time. I'm going to need time, she said. With this, with all of it, the foundation, the organization, whatever this is between us. I'm not capable of moving into a new structure the day after I left an old one. That's not who I am. I know who you are, Roman said. Time. I might decide things you don't expect. That is also something I know about you. He looked at her steadily. I am not offering you a script, Evelyn. I'm offering you a context. What you do inside it is yours. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her coffee. Then she looked out the window at the November morning, which was still doing its thing, cold blue, indifferent, present. I'd like to see the Foundation's current charter documents, she said. The full version, not just the section with my name. I want to understand the governance structure before I make any further decisions about the chair position. Bernard can have them to you by this afternoon. And I'll want to meet with whoever has been managing the organizational reconstruction plan for the Calloway operation. Not to take a role to understand what I'm adjacent to. That's reasonable. And I want my mother involved in the Foundation from the beginning. Not as a consultant, as an actual structural voice in the program design. Also reasonable. She will disagree with you about things. I expect she will, repeatedly. I'm counting on it. Roman set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the table with the look she had been learning to read, the present tense look, the one that the Zat was not managing toward anything. Is there anything else you need this morning? She thought about it. My coat, she said. I left it in the hotel ballroom Tuesday night. Roman looked at her for a moment. Then he reached to his right and picked up something from the chair beside him, a coat, dark wool. Her coat, the one she had left in the Grand Meridian ballroom 2 nights ago, in the context of a completely different life. He placed it on the table between them. She stared at it. How I sent someone for it yesterday morning. I should have thought of it Tuesday night. He paused. I was managing several things simultaneously. She picked up the coat. It was her coat. It smelled faintly of the hotel's coat check, that particular combination of dry-cleaned wools and cedar, and the ambient scent of a room where expensive clothes waited for people who were not yet ready to leave. She held it for a moment, and the holding of it was connected to things she did not have words, for not the coat exactly, but what it represented. The small and ordinary detail of a man who noticed that a woman had left something behind and sent someone to retrieve it, not because it was strategic, not because it was impressive, but simply because it was the right thing to attend to. She put the coat on. She stood up. She looked at Roman Calloway across the breakfast table in the clear morning light, and she did not say thank you, because he had not said it to her when she found the fraud, or when she spoke to Elena Marsh, or when she held the organization together, through a day that would have been easier to walk away from. She picked up her coffee cup and finished the last of it. "I'll call you when I've read the charter," she said. "I'll be here," he said. She went out into the November morning. The drive back to the city took 40 minutes. The driver, not the one from Tuesday night, a different man, younger, with the same professional quiet, did not speak, which she appreciated. She sat in the back of the car that was not the Rolls-Royce and watched Manhattan come back into view on the horizon, the skyline assembling itself in pieces as they crossed back into the city's gravity. The particular experience of returning to a place you lived as though you are arriving in it for the first time. Her apartment was on the 9th floor of a building in Midtown West. She had lived there for 5 years. Grant had never lived there. He had always intended for them to move into something larger, something that announced itself as a Calloway address, something that matched the version of their future he had designed with the same confident incompleteness he brought to everything else. She had decorated it herself, and it was hers. And she walked into it on Wednesday morning with her retrieved coat and 2 days of someone else's borrowed clothing, and the particular clarity of a person who has been through something large and come back knowing something they did not know before. She stood in her own living room and looked at it, her books on the shelves, her plants on the windowsill, 2 of which had been slightly overwatered, and 1 of which was demonstrating that it was fine, and had always been fine, and would continue to be fine, regardless of what she was doing. The small painting she had bought at a street market in her late 20s that Grant had always found slightly too informal. The kitchen with the bread she baked every Sunday, which she had not baked last Sunday, because last Sunday she had went elsewhere and preoccupied with other things. She called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. 3 calls, her mother said, without preamble. "I know. I'm sorry. It was a complicated 48 hours. I gathered. Are you all right?" Evelyn sat down on the couch she had picked out herself in the apartment she had decorated herself, wearing a coat that a man had sent someone to retrieve because she had left it behind and he had noticed. "Yes," she said, "I'm actually all right," which is not what I expected to be saying. Pause. "Tell me," her mother said, so she told her. Not everything, not in one phone call, not with the full detail that everything deserved, but enough. Enough for her mother to understand the shape of it, the sequence, the people involved, and the roles they had played. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was a discipline her mother had developed over 23 years of listening to clients who needed space to tell things in the order they made sense, rather than the order that was most efficient. When Evelyn finished, there was a pause. "This Roman Calloway," her mother said. "Yes, you trust him." Evelyn thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I trust that he was honest with me about what he wanted and why. Trust that what he showed me was real. I don't trust that I have full information yet, because nobody has full information in 48 hours. She paused. "But yes, within those limits, I trust him." Another pause. "The foundation." He left the name blank. "I named it this morning." "What did you call it?" "The Margin Foundation." "Because that's where the work happens." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that Evelyn recognized as the sound her mother made when something surprised her into agreement. "Tell me about the program structure." She described it. "Legal assistance, emergency housing, career support, scholarship access." Her mother asked 3 precise questions about governance, and 2 about funding independence, and 1 about whether the legal assistance programs would operate with pro bono counsel or staff attorneys. Answered the ones she could, and told her mother plainly which ones she didn't yet have the full charter information to answer. "I'll want to see the governance documents," her mother said. "I thought you might. I'm having them sent this afternoon. I'm not signing anything until I've read them. Nobody asked you to sign anything." Yet her mother paused. "You said the chair position." "It's you. That's me, you're sure." Evelyn looked at her living room, at the books and the plants and the painting Grant had never liked. "I've been sure about very little in the last 48 hours, she said. "That one I'm sure about." Her mother made the sound again. "Then, come for dinner this weekend. Bring the documents." "I will." She hung up and sat in the quiet of her apartment for a while. She thought about the ring, which was still on a table in the Grand Meridian ballroom, unless a hotel employee had collected it, which they certainly had by now. She thought about the 7 years. She did not think about them with grief. Exactly, the grief was present, but it was quiet. The appropriate size for what had actually been lost, rather than the catastrophic size it had been 48 hours ago, when she stood on hotel steps in the November air and felt the weight of it as something unsurvivable. She had survived it, more than survived it. She had moved through it into something she could not have designed, because she had not known it existed. She thought about Grant, driving out of the estate before 7 in his own car for the first time in 4 years. She did not know where he had gone, and she recognized that she had in some essential way put that question down. Not indifference. She did not feel indifferent toward him. But the specific, consuming attention she had given his trajectory for 7 years had released, the way a hand released something. It had been holding too tightly for too long, and what she felt in the released hand was not emptiness, but the restored sensation of the hand itself. She made bread on Sunday. She had not planned to. Sunday arrived with a low gray sky and the particular indolence of a morning, with no required structure, and she found herself in her kitchen because the kitchen was where she went when she needed to think without directing the thinking, and the dough was in her hands before she had consciously decided to make it. The familiar motion of pressing and folding and pressing again. The physical work of something that required the right amount of attention to crowd out the wrong kind. She was on her second rest cycle when her phone lit up with a number she did not recognize. She almost let it go. Then she answered Miss Carter Reyes. His voice was the same professional register as always, but there was a quality under it that she read as something between satisfaction and release. I wanted you to hear from me directly, rather than through counsel. Tell me. Darius Pendleton entered a full cooperation agreement this morning. The documentation he's provided in the last 4 days significantly advances the timeline. We're looking at formal charges within the next 3 weeks. He paused. Marcus Vane made a statement this morning, not a cooperation agreement. Statement. He confirmed the basic architecture of the scheme, the timeline, and the use of Calloway organization approval channels. He maintained that the funds were operationally reinvested rather than extracted for personal gain. Do the records support that? Partially. The funds were not personally enriching him in the conventional sense. They were building a parallel operational structure, a pause, which he intended to use as the foundation for an independent organization, once Roman Calloway stepped back from active management. Evelyn stood in her kitchen with flour on her hands. He was building a succession of his own design. Yes, Reyes was quiet for a moment. He believed he was the correct person to lead what he had helped build. He believed Grant was not. He made himself the answer to a question he decided nobody else could be trusted to ask. What happens to him? That's a matter for the courts and his attorneys. What I can tell you is that the cooperation Pendleton has provided is more damaging to Vane's position than Vane's own statement is helpful to it. Reyes paused again. You did exceptional work, Miss Carter. The submitting party documentation you produced, the speed of it, the completeness of it, materially shortened a 14-month investigation by what I estimate is 4 to 6 months. I wanted you to know that directly. She looked at the dough on the counter, at the flour on her hands. Thank you, she said. One more thing. Elena Marsh, he said the name carefully. She's going to face consequences. Her role in the secondary account was knowing and ongoing, but her cooperation was immediate and complete. That will be weighed. He paused. You created the conditions for that cooperation. The way you spoke to her, whatever you said in that office, she walked out of the room ready to tell us everything. Whatever technique that was, it worked. It wasn't a technique, Evelyn said. I just told her the truth and waited for her to believe it was safe. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Well, he said, keep doing that. He hung up. The bread came out well. It always came out well. She had been making the same loaf for 12 years, and she knew the recipe by feel rather than measurement, knew how the dough should behave at each stage, knew the smell of the oven at the right temperature and the sound the crust made when she tapped it to test. She put it on the cooling rack and stood in her kitchen and ate a heel of it while it was still warm, without butter, just the bread itself, which was better that way than most people gave it credit for. 3 weeks later, she was at the Grand Meridian, not for an event, not for anything that required the silver dress or the crystal chandeliers or the particular social theater of New York's wealthiest families performing their relationships at each other. She was there because the hotel had a conference facility she had rented for the morning, and the people seated around the table in that facility were the initial working group of the Margin Foundation lawyers, social workers, 2 former clients of her mother's legal aid office who had agreed to serve on an advisory board and brought with them the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a system that moved faster than you could. Her mother was at the far end of the table, which was where her mother naturally positioned herself. And she was in the middle of making a point about intake procedures that was tactful in its precision and uncompromising in its substance. The two lawyers she was directing it at were listening with the focused attention of people who had realized they were being instructed by someone significantly more experienced than they had anticipated. Roman was not at the table. He was in the room he had come in briefly, at the beginning, and been introduced and had shaken hands with each person present with the particular quality of attention that made people feel individually registered rather than collectively processed. He had said very little. He had listened to the opening 10 minutes of the working session and then stepped out to a chair in the corridor where Evelyn could see him through the glass wall whenever she looked up, reading documents and making notes on a legal pad and not inserting himself into a process that was not his to run. She looked up at one point and found him already looking at her. Not with the evaluating attention of the first night, not with the confirming attention of the morning with the accounts. Just looking, the present tense look. She held it for a moment and then looked back at the table, at her mother making her point, and the lawyers listening and the two advisory board members who had brought the irreplaceable knowledge of their own lives. At the lunch break, she stood in the corridor where Roman had been sitting. He had moved to a window at the end of the hallway, the same instinct she had noticed, before he thought better with a horizon, or he needed one. She stood beside him. Below them, Manhattan moved through its Wednesday afternoon, indifferent and present and exactly itself. Your mother, he said. I know. She told the senior partner from Clifford Manning that his intake form design was built for the comfort of people who don't actually need help. That's accurate. He agreed with her. He was right to. Evelyn looked down at the street, at the city that had been the backdrop to 47 years of her life, and the backdrop to the last 3 weeks of a completely different version of it. She's going to be very good at this. Yes, she already is. Roman was quiet for a moment. The hotel, he said. You chose to hold the first meeting here. She had. She had done it consciously. The morning she booked the conference room, chosen the Grand Meridian specifically, the building where 3 weeks ago she had stood in a silver dress and felt the weight of 7 years discarded. She had come back to it with a foundation working group and her mother making points about intake procedures and a fruitful of people who were going to build something that mattered. The ring, she said. What about it? I came back for it. Before today, I asked the hotel and they'd kept it at the front desk. She reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small wooden box that she had bought at a shop on Hudson Street. The ring was inside, 3.5 carats. A statement, Grant had called it. I don't know what to do with it exactly. But it didn't feel right to leave it in a hotel or throw it away. She looked at the box. It's not what it was, but it was real for a while. Some of what it was real. Roman looked at the box in her hands. He did not reach for it. He simply looked at it with the same attention he gave everything full and present and without the performance of any particular response. Keep it, he said. Put it somewhere you don't have to think about it unless you want to. She put it back in her pocket. She looked out at the city. I've been reading the charter, she said. I know. Bernard says you've sent 17 annotated questions. I have 20 more. I would expect nothing less. Turned to look at him. He was looking at the city too. The November afternoon doing what November afternoons did, dropping light early, giving the buildings a particular quality of late gold that was brief and would not last. He was 63 years old and his hair was silver, and his face had the lines of a man who had lived with significant weight for a long time, and he was standing beside her in the corridor of a hotel where 3 weeks ago her life had collapsed. And none of that was the story she had expected to be inside. I'm not ready to call this anything specific, she said. I know, I need more time than feels comfortable to either of us. Take it. And you need to understand that whatever this becomes, I will not organize myself around your vision. I will work with it, and sometimes against it, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong. I'm counting on that, Roman. She turned to look at him fully. I need you to know that I see you, not the reputation, not the authority, not the role. I see that you've been alone for a long time. I see that you built something enormous, and are not certain in the quiet moments that you built the right thing. I see that you looked at an 11-year file of photographs of someone behaving decently when nobody was watching and decided that such decency was the rarest and most valuable thing you knew. She held his gaze. I see you, and I am not frightened of what I see. But I need you to know that the seeing is mutual, or it's nothing. Roman looked at her for a long moment. The gold light from the city's windows was in his face, and he was not managing his expression, and what was in it was the specific, unperformed thing that appeared in a person's face when they had been recognized by someone they had not expected to be recognized by. Mutual, he said. It has been for 11 years. She nodded. She looked back out at the city. I should go back in, she said. My mother is going to say something else to the lawyers, and I want to be there for it. I'll be here, he said. She went back into the room. Her mother was still at the far end of the table, and the lawyers were still listening, and the 2 advisory board members were making notes. And the work of the Margin Foundation was in its earliest possible form a rough, imperfect, not necessary thing that would require enormous attention and generate enormous conflict, and eventually, if they were careful and honest and willing to be wrong, become something that mattered to people who needed it to exist. Evelyn Carter sat down at the table and opened her notes and began. Outside, November moved toward winter. Inside the Grand Meridian's conference room, the first real work of the Margin Foundation proceeded without ceremony. Down the corridor, Roman Calloway sat in a chair against the wall and read documents on a legal pad and did not insert himself into a process that was not his to run. Because the most important thing he had built in 31 years of building things was finally being built by someone who understood, without being told, that the strongest structures were the ones held up by people who had chosen to hold them, not people who had been placed beneath them without a choice. And in a small wooden box in a jacket pocket, a diamond ring that had once represented someone's idea of a statement sat quiet and still and finished not discarded, not forgotten, simply no longer the point. The woman it had belonged to was already somewhere else, building something that would last.